The battlefield was littered with cold corpses. A white dove perched proudly on a sword plunged into the pristine white snow. The bird tilted its head, its dark eyes observing the deadly silence that enveloped the space. Amidst the desolate scene at the foot of the fortress, a figure in a red cloak stood tall and solitary in the snowstorm. The young knight's breath turned into a white mist in the bone-chilling cold, his face bearing a solemn expression. The blond knight turned his head, his sharp, cold gaze glancing past his glowing golden lion-shaped shoulder armor. Before him was an entire legion of ferocious orcs with bloodshot, bloodthirsty eyes, charging forward like a storm. The sharp blade reflected the hideous images of the monsters, signaling a bloodbath about to begin. Memories flooded back, of earth-shattering battles with dragons throughout the long course of history. Cruel, endless wars where legendary warriors, like the blindfolded swordsman, had fallen, and the figures of great red-haired heroes who were once born and fought in the smoke and flames. He recalled always existing at the center of all events, rushing straight into the sea of fire without hesitation. Before, he once existed in the form of the legendary demon sword, Gruhorn, plunged into the enemy's head. Returning to reality, his armored foot crushed a broken arrow on the ground, the dry clang of metal echoing. Now, standing before the monster legion, his red cloak fluttered proudly in the snowy wind, ready to face battle. Taking on the entire battlefield alone, the lone knight faced thousands of orcs encircling the foot of the ruined fortress. A giant orc swung its bloodthirsty battle axe down with immense power, tearing through the air. The axe blade chopped down, crushing an unfortunate soldier, fresh blood splashing and dyeing the pristine white snow red along with a tragic scream. The orc chieftain let out a savage roar, exuding a crimson killing intent that made the surrounding space tremble violently. But this time, he was no longer an inanimate weapon. His armored hand gripped the sword hilt tightly, and a stream of blue energy began to surge. The knight's eyes glowed with blue light. He drew his sword, declaring his knightly identity, and exploded with power, sweeping away everything. The deep blue eye opened wide, pupils contracted with deadly killing intent, signaling the beginning of the massacre. The blond knight's cold face appeared from behind the smoke, blue energy leaking coolly from his left eye. A blue mana explosion swept away the white snow, freezing an entire vast valley and dyeing it red with enemy blood. From beneath the cold ground, the fiery blue souls of fallen warriors began to rise from their graves. Ghost knights in tattered armor knelt down, obeying their master's absolute summoning command. The legendary trio of old reappeared in spirit form, their overwhelming aura making the monsters tremble. The blond knight smirked proudly, his lion armor shining with a dazzling aura like a god. A giant energy storm rose high into the sky, sweeping away everything in its path and causing the Orc Legion to break formation. The area of effect skill, Winter's Serenade, activated, and the Ghost Legion began to sweep through the orcs like a flash flood. He dashed like an arrow, his sword dragging on the snow, creating a long, powerful trail, ready for impact. The giant holy sword plunged into the ground, a powerful testament to forgotten legends. His armored hand gripped the sword hilt tightly, his eyes gleaming with extreme excitement before the decisive moment. He wielded his sword like an artist, each slash sending an orc head flying in an instant, without time to scream. Two female spirit generals glided past his shoulders, charging straight into the enemy formation at incredible speed to support their master. Memories flooded back to his mind. All of them had once been his tough comrades through life and death. The masters and disciples of old were now mercilessly crushing the enemy with spiritual power. The black-haired swordswoman lightly parried the giant orc's immense axe blow, as if playing with children. The brunette swordswoman revealed her berserk nature, her eyes burning with bloodlust, as she swung her sword to finish off her opponent. A sharp sword strike split the giant monster in half, fresh blood spraying out like a fountain, dyeing the entire frame red. The blond knight calmly wiped the bloodstain from his cheek, his sharp, cold gaze sweeping over the now-cleared battlefield. The orc boss stepped out with an oppressive aura, marking the official beginning of an era of suffering for humanity. He roared wildly, swinging his giant fist, intending to crush his opponent like a mere ant. The blond knight's eyes glowed with blue mana, immediately activating his serious mode to face the battle. Two streams of power collided terrifyingly as he calmly parried the monster's immense attack. The ground beneath his feet cracked open from the aftershocks of the collision, but his stance remained as firm as a rock, without wavering. He smirked proudly, his face smudged with battlefield dust, yet still exuding a deadly handsome charm. Memories of a legendary era flooded back, where the holy sword was plunged into a lush green meadow, awaiting the worthy one. His fiery red soul appeared, recalling a past where he was once reincarnated as a dominant sword. Over hundreds of years, He had passed through the hands of countless masters, turning them into heroes whose names were etched in history. Then destiny allowed him to meet the comrade of his life, a formidable warrior named Leon Burke. From a nameless boy in a remote village, they swept through all kinds of monsters, from wolves to skeletons. Together, the two roamed the world, man and sword united, creating breathtaking battles unmatched by anyone. The warrior roared to the heavens, pouring all his strength into every sword stroke, to carve his name into history. Their journey led them to the frigid, snowy mountains, where dark storms and lightning covered the sky. A terrifying energy explosion tore through space, signaling the appearance of a boss-level evil entity. His comrade coughed up fresh blood, utterly exhausted, but still clutched the sword hilt tightly. The giant black shadow of the final boss, Black Dragon, descended, heavy pressure weighing down on the small warrior. The dragon let out a terrifying roar, revealing its sharp fangs and fiery eyes of death. The warrior collapsed onto the cold snow, using his sword as a final support against imminent death. A beam of destructive light descended, engulfing the hero in a sea of deadly purple-pink energy. Leon Burke laughed defiantly with a blood-soaked face, urging his comrade to rush into the final battle. Before them was the giant black shadow of the Black Dragon, exuding overwhelming killing intent. Leon Burke swung his sword, his eyes burning with determination to fight to the death against this boss-level monster. He charged straight into the dragon's jaws of death, without a hint of fear before imminent demise. From above, Leon Burke's sword point descended like an ultimate punishment. A sword strike imbued with blue energy tore through space, slicing the dragon in half in an instant. The monster fell, marking the end of a bloody and glorious legend. After the victory, his comrade ascended to the throne, ruling the kingdom in prosperity. As for him, now a holy sword, he stood silently and alone under the spotlight of history. Leon Burke left his dying wish, entrusting the protection of his descendants to his trusted sword. Time passed, until one day, space violently shook with loud noises. The sword groggily awoke, visibly annoyed by its 1,000-year slumber being disturbed. It was furious at being shaken violently like dice, making it dizzy. A fat man with a greedy face was screaming wildly, claiming to be the new master. The panicked soldiers tried to intervene, fearing the fat man would defile the king's forbidden holy artifact. The sword was astonished, unable to believe its ears upon hearing that this pig was actually a prince. The fat man stubbornly yelled, asserting his supreme authority that no one was allowed to touch. The sword broke out in a cold sweat, feeling that something was extremely wrong with this descendant. It was forced to activate its judgment ability to appraise what kind of good-for-nothing this person was. The information panel displayed the name Adrian Leon Burke, along with a plethora of flaws like obesity and laziness, leaving the sword speechless. Adrian gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down like rain, swearing that no one would dare to look down on him again. Gruhorn looked at its new master with disdain, considering his words merely the babbling of a clown. The fat man raised the sword high, yelling to borrow the dragon-slaying power, but only received utter contempt from the holy artifact. He opened his mouth wide and screamed Gruhorn's name like a pig being slaughtered, giving everyone a headache. Adrian swung the sword wildly in the palace, terrifying the soldiers and maids, who screamed for him to calm down. Ignoring the prohibition against drawing swords, he chased after the servants, threatening to kill anyone who dared to order him around. He deluded himself into thinking that if he could grasp Gruhorn's power, those pieces of trash would vanish. But life wasn't a dream. His bulging belly betrayed him. Adrian tripped and fell flat on his face, plunging headfirst in an extremely awkward posture. He let out a bewildered cry when he saw the sword point plunged into the floor, standing upright right before his fall. Fresh blood splattered as the holy sword pierced through the good-for-nothing prince, to the utter horror of the soldiers. The maid's face drained of all color. She covered her mouth with her hand, witnessing this bloody self-destruction. Adrian lay motionless in a pool of blood. The soldiers frantically called for the royal physician, while the maid collapsed from shock. Gruhorn was equally astonished, realizing the one impaled was its useless master, truly a scoundrel to the very end. Adrian's vision blurred. Tears and snot smeared his face as death was rapidly approaching him. The sword's consciousness also flickered. For the first time in its life as a sword, it felt like it was about to faint along with this good-for-nothing corpse. If this incompetent and arrogant Adrian ascended the throne, the kingdom would be doomed, facing a bleak and hopeless future. He was a true pig, ignorant, lazy, cruel, and only his greed was unmatched in the kingdom. After that disastrous self-destruction, Adrian miraculously survived, and a strange rumor began to spread throughout the gloomy castle. The maids whispered among themselves that the prince had changed his ways recently, no longer overturning tables or gathering with his debauched companions. They scoffed sarcastically that he must be afraid of death, which is why he was reining himself in. but things would surely return to how they were. What else could they expect? Adrian put on a serious face, completely disregarding the trivial rumors of the servants about his transformation. He sat on the chair, filled with bewilderment, realizing he had just stabbed to death the descendant of his former comrade and taken over this obese body. A maid rushed in panicked, announcing the king's arrival, and urging him to quickly tidy his attire for a proper reception. Adrian remained seated sluggishly, grumbling that the old man had vanished when he was on the verge of death. So what the hell was he showing up for now? A middle-aged man with an overwhelming aura appeared behind the maid, coldly reminding her to be careful with her words in front of superiors. The silver-haired old man scrutinized Adrian, sarcastically remarking that even if he had returned from the dead, his bad habits remained exactly the same. The old man subtly dismissed the maid, believing the king expected nothing from his good-for-nothing son, while Adrian was bewildered, not knowing who the old man was. The old man pressed him, asking why Adrian had ignored their teacher-student relationship of so many years and didn't even bother to greet him properly. Adrian looked at the old man with a judgmental gaze, secretly deducing that this was the tutor of this useless pig prince. Seeing Adrian blankly say his memory was jumbled, the tutor began to break out in a cold sweat as he vaguely guessed the serious problem. A loud shout echoed, announcing the king's arrival, startling the tutor who turned back, while Adrian remained completely calm. Heavy footsteps entered, and Adrian secretly confirmed that this was the father of the useless body he was currently inhabiting. Adrian widened his eyes in surprise as he sensed an extraordinary aura, much stronger than he had imagined. The king entered with a majestic demeanor, and Adrian secretly assessed that the lion's bloodline might not have been diluted into dog's blood as he had thought. The king-father looked at his cursed son still sitting there idly, uttering words of disappointment that even death hadn't changed him at all. The tutor hastily reported Adrian's memory loss, causing the soldiers and maids to panic, screaming as if the house was on fire. The royal physician was immediately summoned to thoroughly examine Adrian, who was lying listlessly on the sickbed. The royal physician broke out in a cold sweat, reporting that the prince's precious body was completely normal, with no physical damage whatsoever. The king frowned in worry as he heard the physician explain that this might be a temporary psychological shock after the accident. When the physician concluded with the words memory loss, Adrian flinched, fearing that his clumsy act had been exposed to everyone. The sharp-bearded old man smirked, uttering a sarcastic remark about the suspiciously convenient nature of memory loss. Adrian broke out in a cold sweat as he realized his excuse of memory loss was being twisted into an act of denying past responsibilities. The king began a moral lecture, stating that mistakes are part of growth if one knows how to correct them. His face hardened with fury as he emphasized that Adrian had completely forgotten those painful lessons. The old man asserted in a harsh tone that because he had forgotten everything, this cursed son hadn't made any progress from the pile of past garbage. The tutor hastily intervened as the king was about to rush in and discipline his son, while Adrian secretly thought the old man was truly scolding him. The king clicked his tongue and left with a look of disdain, making Adrian realize he had just stepped into a pile of dung and would be treated worse than trash. Adrian gritted his teeth in resentment, wondering how badly the former owner of this body had lived to be hated like a mangy dog. While he was tense, a female voice called out a familiar name, startling him. The queen rushed over and embraced her precious son, crying profusely over his bewilderment. She squeezed Adrian so tightly that his eyes rolled back, while saying that trashy past could be forgotten. The queen lifted Adrian's chubby face and complained that he had gotten thinner, leaving him speechless, wondering how someone this fat could be called thin. She smiled kindly, expressing boundless happiness at seeing her son awaken after his near-fatal accident. She hugged Adrian tightly, instructing him never to touch dangerous things like that sword again. The queen sobbed profusely again, embracing her large son, leaving Adrian to only endure it with a helpless expression. Looking at the demonic sword propped in the corner of the room, Adrian broke out in a cold sweat and secretly apologized, for their real son was already gone. Night fell, enveloping the magnificent castle, bringing with it a heavy and oppressive atmosphere for the stand-in. The queen bid farewell and left, leaving Adrian slumped onto the chair like an exhausted pile of fat. He let out a long, drawn-out sigh, his face clearly showing fatigue after the tumultuous family drama. Adrian mused, recalling his promise to protect his comrade's descendant. But ironically, he himself was the one who had sent this nephew to his demise. He calmed himself, his sharp, cold eyes filled with determination to live a meaningful life, so as not to betray the innocent death of this body. Recalling his previous life as a renowned holy sword specialized in clearing battlefields, he was confident he was more than capable of handling this situation. Adrian clenched his chubby fist, asserting that this incompetent, obese body was no big deal at all. He smirked with arrogant pride, proudly boasting of his achievement of having trained dozens of heroes since they were infants. The first thing to do was to spring from the chair and begin forging a mana heart to restore his power. Adrian took a deep breath, concentrating his mind to sense and gather the meager energy into his lungs. Streams of blue mana began to gather before his chest, swirling violently as if to crystallize into a core of power. With a boom, the nascent energy mass shattered into tiny fragments and vanished into the void. He stood frozen on the spot, staring in shock as his efforts turned into smoke in an instant. Adrian clutched his chest, panting, cold sweat pouring down profusely from the unexpected backlash from his own body. He opened his eyes wide, realizing a bitter truth. This trashy body was completely unable to contain mana. Refusing to accept defeat, he tensed his body and circulated his energy once more, determined to force the energy flow to obey. Adrian gritted his teeth, pouring all his will to force the mana into submission. Despite his body's frantic resistance, he roared in his mind, trying to cram the power in until the veins on his neck bulged, but it was still hopeless. As a result, Adrian fell face first onto the floor, with his rear end sticking up in a completely humiliating posture of defeat. He lay sprawled on the floor, gasping for breath, beginning to question his life about how useless this body was. Adrian was so furious his face contorted, unable to believe there could be such a terrible body that even rejected basic power. He curled up in despair, wishing he had his old body back to violently punch mana straight into this stubborn corpse. A knock on the door sounded, interrupting his fit of rage. A respectful voice echoed in, asking permission to disturb the prince. The maid entered with a tray of steaming medicine, announcing it was a premium tonic personally sent by the queen. The maid tremblingly offered the medicine, trying to use the queen's name to plead with this difficult prince to drink it and be done with it. Seeing her pale face and profuse sweating was enough to understand the pressure of serving such a powerful good-for-nothing. Adrian swatted the bowl of medicine away, adamantly refusing to put anything more into his fat belly, and yelled furiously. But just as the bowl flew away, his gaze froze as if he had just discovered a treasure amidst trash. The shimmering liquid in the bowl was emitting a pure blue mana flow that he had yearned for all this time. Quick as lightning, he lunged forward and snatched the bowl of medicine just before it hit the ground, startling the maid. Without a second's hesitation, Adrian tipped the bowl into his mouth, gulping it down like a dying man finding a spring. The maid froze completely, her eyes wide, not understanding what on earth was happening with this erratic prince. Placing the sparkling clean bowl back on the tray, he coldly dismissed her, as if no struggle had just occurred. As soon as the maid bowed and retreated, Adrian's eyes immediately sharpened, preparing for a grand plan with the new energy source. He began to direct the newly absorbed energy flow. A blue mana flame flared up on his chubby palm. His eyes glowed brightly, confirming that the tonic was the perfect fuel to restart his fighting machine. Although the mana amount was meager and would dissipate after a day, with his skill level, even these remnants were enough to build upon. The room door burst open. Adrian rushed out, blocking the maid's path as she was trying to slip away quietly, startling her out of her wits. He pointed at her face, pressing her to tell him how many more bowls of this mana-infused medicine were left in storage so he could collect them all. A few days later, Adrian's hand was covered by a much denser and more stable layer of mana, thanks to continuous tonic intake. He smirked arrogantly, sensing that the moment of this body's transformation was very near. Adrian focused all his strength, gathering all the energy to take the bold step of forging a mana heart. With his past life's experience, he confidently declared that recreating this energy core was as easy as pie, even with his eyes closed. But life was not a dream. A sudden heart-wrenching pain struck, making him realize this useless body wasn't strong enough to handle the load. Recalling his past life as a legendary weapon, he began the process of forging the energy core with intense concentration. Adrian clutched his chest, in pain as if it would explode, realizing the price to pay for power was never cheap. He gritted his teeth and endured, telling himself he absolutely could not collapse at this critical moment. Chaotic energy threatened to tear apart his useless body. If he fainted now, it would be game over due to mana backlash. Sweat poured down him like rain, his face contorted as he strained against the sky-piercing pain. Adrian hunched over, pouring all his will to force that wild energy flow into submission. In his mind, he imagined his hand grasping the wild mana, preventing it from running rampant. He must not be hasty. He slowly guided the flow to follow the correct path to the right of his heart. Each drop of pure energy began to condense, gradually permeating his body like water flowing into a hollow. The blue aura gradually stabilized around Adrian, signaling that the critical moment had passed. His eyes snapped open, gleaming with the cold, sharp light of one who had just conquered death. Adrian knelt on the floor, sighing in relief. The hellish process was finally complete. A brilliant mana heart appeared in his consciousness, not a custom-made item for others, but his very own. The fat man sprang to his feet, laughing gleefully, proudly showing off his achievement of successfully forging the energy core. Just as he was about to strike a cool celebratory pose, a yellow notification panel suddenly appeared, interrupting his excitement. The smile on Adrian's face vanished, replaced by a bewildered expression, not understanding what was happening. He stared wide-eyed at the notification text, "Mana Heart Creation Successful," wondering if this was the legendary status panel. Adrian broke out in a cold sweat when he realized this interface was identical to what he used to send to his master in his previous life. A series of error windows popped up continuously, signaling a flickering connection and unlocking the power of judgment, startling him. The system continued to spam notifications, unlocking farsight and clairaudience, making Adrian stare in astonishment out the window. Adrian activated his supernatural vision, seeing every vein and leaf detail clearly, as if activating a cheat. He broke out in a cold sweat as his hearing suddenly became overly sensitive, sounds echoing uncontrollably in his ears. The maids were huddled together, badmouthing him behind his back, unaware that Adrian, standing in his room, could hear everything clearly through the walls. His head pounded, visual signals distorted and flickering wildly due to system overload. A red alert notification appeared. His mana was completely depleted, forcing all his skills to shut down. Adrian clutched his head in frustration, realizing this pathetic body limited his power to a miserable degree. He regretfully recalled his golden age as a divine sword, perceiving all things without a blind spot. Now, with a minuscule amount of mana, he could only eavesdrop or see slightly further than ordinary people. The fat man clenched his fists, smiling ambitiously, determined that his first task was to diligently expand his mana reservoir. Before he could even look cool for 3 seconds, his fat belly rumbled loudly, protesting and demanding urgent energy replenishment. Adrian frowned due to the gnawing hunger. The physiological needs of this body were truly bothersome. The servants turned pale with fear and rushed to find food, while he took the opportunity to plan his adaptation to a mortal guise. The queen appeared with a radiant expression, as if she had struck gold, moved to tears by her son's transformation. She rushed to pinch Adrian's cheeks until they were distorted, doting on him for obediently drinking all the bitter medicine. A man dressed in black, exuding killing intent, entered the room, interrupting the tearful mother-son moment. The scarred man asked if Adrian recognized him, receiving a cold shake of the head from his nephew. The queen sighed, confirming her son had lost his memory, and asked her brother to guide the boy. Adrian glanced, assessing his maternal uncle, feeling that the man's smile was not very benevolent. His uncle sneered mockingly, stating that Adrian's trashy past, even if forgotten, no one would mourn. Adrian's expression hardened, his eyes turning sharp, preparing to straighten out his precious uncle's disrespectful attitude. His maternal uncle looked down at his nephew's jiggling fat belly and declared that the only thing he would do was help him lose weight. He coldly warned him not to expect anything more, causing the queen to hastily nod, accepting the harsh condition. Adrian was bewildered, not understanding what was happening, with huge question marks above his head. His uncle's gaze turned sharp and terrifying, as if he wanted to devour the person in front of him alive. Wham! Adrian was roughly thrown onto the floor, making him cry out in pain. His uncle stood tall and declared that all his activities from now on would require permission, and that he should forget his title as prince. He smirked, sneering, hinting that if Adrian tried hard, he might be taught a bit of the family's traditional swordsmanship. Adrian gritted his teeth, finding it ridiculous that a junior dared to show off his meager skills in front of a master like him. His uncle continued to provoke him upon seeing Adrian tremble, thinking his nephew was deeply resentful. Adrian unexpectedly stood up and bowed, boldly proposing a wager to his uncle. He firmly declared that within half a year, he would make his uncle acknowledge his abilities. Adrian smiled calculatingly, promising that if he failed, he would completely follow his uncle's arrangements. His uncle showed interest in his nephew's bold words and heard the counter-condition. A wish if Adrian won. He accepted the challenge, seeing it as an amusing diversion to see what his nephew could accomplish. Adrian panted heavily after his bold declaration, realizing the harsh reality of his weak body. He felt every fatty muscle jiggle violently, cursing this heavy, useless physique. Adrian's footsteps began to emit a blue aura as he decided to use drastic measures. He activated his mana, making it surge, determined to use the energy to burn off the excess fat on his body. His uncle's eyes widened in astonishment, unable to believe his senses when he saw his useless nephew could use mana. He rushed over and grabbed Adrian's shoulders, with an expression of utter shock at the illogical phenomenon he had just witnessed. Adrian panted, sweating profusely as if he had taken a bath after his display of burning fat with mana. His uncle's eyes bulged as he yelled, his face distorted in disbelief that his nephew had created a mana heart. He smirked slyly, pretending to be naive as he asked again, as if this was no big deal. Adrian casually displayed the blue mana flame in his hand, his voice full of provocation, asking his uncle if he regretted the wager. His uncle's face darkened, and he growled, asking if his nephew was insane to create such a thing. He continued to interrogate him about the origin of the secret technique, looking at Adrian as if he were a criminal unaware he had just committed a fatal error. Adrian's face went blank, his head full of question marks. Hearing his uncle's overly serious tone, he froze completely, hearing his uncle bluntly declare that a mana heart was merely a trashy technique for bottom-tier mercenaries. Adrian's piercing scream of pain echoed throughout the entire castle, scattering birds in all directions. He clutched his face, sweating profusely, bitterly realizing that his overwhelming knowledge from the old era was now severely outdated. The uncle still didn't let up, adding a few more remarks to emphasize the technique's obsolescence, rubbing salt into his nephew's wounds. Adrian's face was blank, his soul feeling as if it was leaving his body from the overwhelming shock. He roared, demanding an explanation, but the uncle merely turned his back coldly, telling him to open his eyes and see. The uncle channeled his power, surging blue mana enveloping his body with immense power, causing the air to vibrate. Adrian perceived a strange mana circle glowing in the uncle's eyes, completely different from his own knowledge. He swung his hand, unleashing a razor-sharp sword energy slash from above, startling Adrian and making him step back. The colliding energies created a loud explosion, demonstrating the overwhelming power of the modern technique. While demonstrating, the uncle explained that the mana chain could crush the energy of the mana heart and was many times more stable. He recounted the tragic history of the Eli family to emphasize that no one foolishly used the mana heart in this era anymore. Adrian buried his head in the basic theory book, sweating profusely as he admitted that times had truly changed. The mages flailed around with garish green magic circles to cast their spells. As for the knights, they strenuously wove several chains to gather mana, and just hearing about it sounded cumbersome. Their power levels were divided based on the number of chains, from 1 chain all the way to 5 chains. Adrian slammed the book shut with a thud, reluctantly admitting that this pile of theories wasn't entirely rubbish. He slid his finger across the book cover, stopping at the author's name, Ernest Altringen, which sounded familiar. Suddenly, he let out a sound of realization, as memories from his past life flooded back like a torrent in his mind. Back then, a fierce young man came looking for him, asking if he was the legendary sword saint. His name was Ernest Altringen, and he wore intimidating black armor, challenging him to see who truly deserved the title of sword saint with some strange techniques. Adrian stroked his chin and sneered. No wonder that name sounded so familiar. It turned out to be an old acquaintance. He curled his lips meaningfully, curious about what had become of that defeated man, who was now the progenitor of a theory. Back in reality, Adrian stretched his limbs right in the middle of the training ground, leaving the bewildered soldiers wondering what was happening. The uncle looked at his nephew with a scrutinizing gaze, asking if he had bothered to read the book from last night. He stood there with his arms crossed, confident that Adrian had realized the foolishness of choosing the outdated mana heart path. Adrian merely smiled faintly, a confident smile that sent chills down others' spines. He crossed his arms and retorted sharply, asserting that he didn't feel he was wrong at all. The uncle frowned in annoyance, thinking his nephew was still stubborn and unwilling to accept the obvious truth. Adrian raised his hand, explaining that not all mana hearts were useless as the uncle thought. He erupted with aura, a brilliant blue mana enveloping his plump body, asking if the uncle had heard of the difference in class. The uncle's eyes widened, seeing for the first time such terrifying pressure emanating from the nephew he still looked down upon. He quickly regained his composure, standing tall and sneering that Adrian was like those mercenaries who deluded themselves into being ancient heroes. Vale recalled how the small fry of the past fell like ripe plums, unable to withstand the pressure of 2 mana circles. Adrian sneered defiantly, telling the uncle to try defeating a 2-chain knight, his tone extremely arrogant. Vale curled his lips, accepting the challenge, declaring that he would become his guardian, as per the queen's wish. Adrian smiled slyly, wondering if this formidable uncle's protection would be a blessing or a curse for his small life. Both stood facing each other in the training ground, killing intent beginning to stir, making even the surrounding guards feel intimidated. The uncle took a powerful step forward, growling as he asked if his nephew was doubting his skill. He erupted with aura, proudly declaring himself a count of the kingdom and the commander of the Northern Army. The next title was proclaimed. He was the master of the Black Spear Knight Order and one of the 5 renowned Silver Lions. Surging blue mana flared up like hellfire, enveloping the imposing figure of the war general. His eyes glowed with blue light, asserting the class of one who had woven 4 mana circles, a true and genuine quad-chain knight. He concluded by stating his name was Val Ballerhard, the powerful man who would stand behind his nephew from now on. Adrian sweat profusely as the terrifying pressure swept over him, the uncle pressing him, asking if that was enough credibility. Without letting Adrian catch his breath, Vale lunged forward like lightning with his unsheathed sword, brimming with killing intent. The razor-sharp blade stopped right at Adrian's throat, so fast that the onlooker's eyes couldn't follow. Vale retracted his sword, wearing a triumphant smile after successfully putting the arrogant nephew in his place. Adrian forced a laugh, his face drenched in sweat, reminding the uncle not to go back on his word. As soon as the training session ended, Adrian collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air like a beached fish, his entire body aching. His plump hand trembled violently as he tried to cling to the edge of the table, the aftershocks of fear not yet faded. His eyes wide with horror, he muttered that he had almost died because of this foolish challenge. Vale's scornful smile still echoed in his mind, mocking that it was hard enough for him to defeat a one-chain now, let alone dream of two. Adrian stumbled down the corridor in a tattered state, muttering curses at the wicked uncle who had just put him through the ringer. As the room door opened, Adrian jumped in surprise to see someone already waiting inside. The old royal physician bowed respectfully, his demeanor indescribably insincere. Adrian glared and shouted, unable to understand why this old quack had shown his face here at this moment. The royal physician gathered greenish energy in his hand, intending to heal, which made Adrian scream in terror as if being slaughtered. He struggled and refused, kicking the old man out, fearing that all his painful training efforts would go to waste. Adrian panted heavily, glaring daggers at the royal knight for his intention to erase Adrian's precious muscle soreness. The royal knight could only remain silent, breaking out in a cold sweat at the prince's incomprehensible eccentricity. The door swung open again, and a man in bright red clothes entered with a cheerful expression, as if looking for a relative. While Adrian was eating, he stood there with his arms crossed, a smug smile evident on his handsome yet cunning face. Adrian paused while scooping soup, glancing at the newcomer with eyes full of suspicion and annoyance. He ignored everything, continued stuffing food into his mouth, and wondered what was wrong with this guy, standing there acting so dramatically. The royal knight whispered into Adrian's ear, reminding him that this was the esteemed second prince of the kingdom. The second prince made sarcastic remarks about Adrian's accident, displaying a sickeningly fake attitude in front of the servants. Adrian chewed noisily as he retorted sharply, asking if his elder brother was too idle, coming here just to pick a fight. The second prince's eyes darkened, and he sneered, mocking the fool who had once stabbed himself with a sword. He stepped behind Adrian, dropping a meaningful hint about interesting news he had just heard in the palace. Adrian stopped eating, his gaze sharpening when he heard mention of the bet with Count Ballerhard. The second prince smirked sinisterly, his fingers stroking his chin calculatingly, as if he had just stumbled upon a windfall. He leaned close to Adrian's face, his eyes blazing with challenge, as he offered to replace the opponent in the upcoming match. Adrian sat blankly at the dining table with a world-weary expression, while the royal knight stood behind him, guarding like a guardian statue. He wondered which nerve had short-circuited in that Jillian guy, making him laugh maniacally like a mad clown. The knight leaned into Adrian's ear, explaining that Jillian was famous everywhere for his innate swordsmanship talent from a young age. An image of Jillian appeared proudly, boasting the achievement of connecting 2 mana circles at the age of 14, proving he was the real deal, and not to be underestimated. The conversation was cut short when the maid timidly entered, drenched in sweat, afraid of disturbing her master. She carried a towering stack of letters that covered her entire face, announcing that all this junk mail was for Adrian. Adrian took a letter with a bewildered expression, wondering why people who had previously treated him like trash were suddenly interested. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. His intuition told him there was a strong scent of danger nearby. He opened the letter to read it, and the atmosphere in the room grew heavy as challenging words caught his eye. The content was full of flowery words requesting guidance, but in reality, it was an excuse to legally beat him up because of the bet. In Adrian's mind, an image appeared of a flock of hypocritical vultures grinning, eagerly awaiting an opportunity to torment the weak. He gritted his teeth and sneered, realizing he had become a juicy, tempting prey for the entire kingdom to tear apart. Adrian called the maid back sharply, gripping the letter tightly, his tone changing 180 degrees. With a calculating and sinister smile, he ordered her to record a list of all those audacious enough to send letters. The scene shifted to a stone-paved training ground, where a wooden sword was thrown to the ground with a rough, decisive thud. Adrian froze for a few seconds, cold sweat beginning to roll down his forehead as he didn't understand what the hell was happening. The sword lay haphazardly at the feet of a man exuding a suffocatingly oppressive aura. The royal uncle coldly ordered Adrian to pick up the sword without bothering to explain a single word. He declared that Adrian needed to know some basics for the bet to be valid, cutting off all excuses about not being taught. Adrian bent down to pick up the sword, muttering curses under his breath, resentful that his uncle didn't even bother to hand him the sword, but threw it to the ground like charity. Adrian wailed miserably about his muscle pain, but his uncle coldly ordered him to shut up immediately. The royal uncle looked at his chubby nephew with a suspicious look, asking if he hadn't received treatment, which was why he was groaning so much. The commander sternly lectured that if one bore the title of a knight, they must know their own body's limits. He bluntly explained that magic only restored the original state and wouldn't make those loose muscles any bigger. The uncle sighed in exasperation, turning away as he didn't want to argue further about Adrian's poor physical condition. He glanced past Adrian, declaring coldly that it was not as important as today's practical combat lesson. A gleaming steel sword was drawn, accompanied by a warning that he was only allowed to see the demonstration once. Blue mana exploded around the blade as he introduced the introductory sword form for the kingdom's knights. The blade sliced through the air swiftly, leaving sharp after-images in its wake. The uncle moved agilely, performing basic sword strokes full of power and speed. Each strike was unleashed in quick succession and decisively, creating a dazzling display of swordsmanship. His eyes were sharp and highly focused as he swung his sword, tearing through the air with a master's technique. The sword glowed brightly, with blue energy, gripped tightly in his hands as he prepared for a decisive strike. A heavy downward slash created a chilling sound of tearing wind, making the surrounding space tremble. The aftershock of the blow formed a circle of energy, sweeping away the dust at the commander's feet. Adrian stood frozen in place, his chubby face revealing extreme astonishment at what he had just witnessed. He suddenly burst into delighted laughter, asking if this was truly a foundational exercise. The royal uncle glanced back with suspicion, feeling his nephew's attitude today was too unusual. He was rambling on about how this simple form was suitable for an incompetent person like Adrian. Adrian's arrogant guffaw rang out, interrupting his uncle and leaving the old commander bewildered. Adrian clutched his face, laughing uncontrollably, lamenting the irony of time as he witnessed the current technique. In his memories, this was the legendary dragon-slaying sword art that once decapitated mad dragons. Adrian's face darkened with killing intent upon seeing the supreme technique of old, now regarded as a cheap health exercise. The uncle warned that merely practicing these basics wouldn't lead to victory, but Adrian coldly brushed him off. He shouldered the wooden sword with an arrogant expression, asserting confidently that this one move was enough to sweep away everything. The old commander glanced at his nephew with suspicious eyes, not understanding where he got such blind confidence. Ignoring his uncle's words, Adrian gripped the wooden sword tightly, his hands trembling violently, either from excitement or due to his weak body. He swung his sword powerfully into the void, creating a rather forceful whistling sound. The downward strike looked strong, but the stance of this obese body was clumsy and full of openings in the eyes of a master. Adrian broke out in a cold sweat, bitterly admitting the harsh truth that this body was betraying him. The reason current swordsmanship is scorned is because the descendants have lost the will to slay dragons in every sword stroke. Those who discard the mana heart and forget how to breathe soul into their swords, how could they understand the true essence of martial arts? In the eyes of those novices, the true value of the legendary dragon-slaying sword art was no different from a pile of trash. The wooden sword slammed hard onto the ground with a thud, ending a strike full of technical errors and lacking control. The uncle immediately signaled to stop, looking at his panting nephew with a stern expression like an overseer. He began to lecture that flexing one's arms vigorously was useless without knowing how to circulate energy. The commander poked Adrian's flabby belly with his sword to remind him about his body's center of gravity. Furthermore, he also whipped his leg hard, making Adrian cry out in pain and let out a pathetic groan. Adrian knelt on the floor from exhaustion, his ears still forced to listen to his uncle explain the principle of full-body force application. He reluctantly agreed, then staggered to his feet, telling himself that this useless body was truly disgracing the original. Adrian declared grandly that he would prove the dragon-slaying sword art was not trash, as people thought. One day, then 2 days passed. The steady, relentless thud of running footsteps signaling the beginning of a hellish streak of days. By the third day, Adrian was still dragging his heavy body, panting heavily under the watchful eyes of the guards. A week passed, and he began to swing the wooden sword with a much less awkward stance, sweat pouring down like rain. Then, a month swiftly passed, and he meditated to feel the vibrant blue mana surging brightly within his chest. Adrian coughed violently from exhaustion, but the system panel immediately reported good news, that his physique had changed after the arduous training. The title, morbidly obese, finally disappeared, replaced by common obesity thanks to a greatly boosted metabolism. He stood in a stable stance like a bronze tower, The system confirmed that the previous clumsy and foolish trait had been completely removed. A sharp whistling sound of tearing wind erupted as the wooden sword was swung at a speed difficult for the naked eye to follow. Adrian smiled smugly as he swung his sword, accompanied by a mana-shrouded effect. His body had now truly adapted to accumulating energy. The troublesome mana perception disorder had been kicked away, replaced by genuine mana perception ability, allowing him to swing his sword with confidence. He wielded his sword much more smoothly than a month ago when he was a novice, his sword strokes cleanly tearing through the air. Adrian tensed his body, channeling force into his hands, feeling distinctly stronger today than yesterday. His eyes glowed wildly. Just as he was about to unleash an even more perfect strike, a frantic shout told him to stop. Adrian looked up in bewilderment as the wooden sword in his hand had snapped in half, his uncle's furious shout still echoing in his ears. Splintered wood fragments flew everywhere after the extremely powerful impact. Under the pouring rain, Adrian stood panting with the broken sword, facing his uncle, who held a real sword with a serious expression. His hand gripped the sword hilt so tightly it bled, fresh red blood trickling down the jagged broken wood. Fresh blood mixed with rainwater dripped onto the cold ground, forming a small puddle. Adrian innocently called out to his uncle, while the northern count stared in shock at his nephew, who had just accomplished the impossible. Adrian panted, his face drenched with rainwater, eyes wide open as he felt his body reach its limit. His powerful swing made the wooden sword unable to withstand the force and shatter, fragments scattering everywhere. The training log was split open, smoking profusely, proving the recent strike contained immense destructive power. Adrian stood stunned, a chill running down his spine as he realized he had just unleashed a blow beyond his control. The uncle rushed over and yelled directly at him, scolding him as an idiot for daring to train frantically in such harsh weather. The count glared and warned that if that had been a real sword, Adrian's small life would have been lost due to the recoil. Adrian's hands trembled uncontrollably, his skin bruised and torn, blood mixed with rainwater streaming down. The system unexpectedly announced he had awakened from a state of extreme focus and gained a new, powerful trait: hyperfocus. Adrian gave a faint, wry smile, his expression showing both satisfaction from his achievement and extreme exhaustion. He staggered and fell backward. In his mind, he only managed to think that if he focused again, he might actually be struck dead by lightning. No joke. The uncle quickly rushed to support Adrian's collapsing body, while the guards behind them cried out in alarm. Looking at his unconscious nephew in his arms, in such a pathetic state, the uncle's eyes showed a complex mix of emotions, tinged with a hint of respect. He affectionately called him a foolish brat, then scooped him up, disregarding the pouring rain. Adrian awoke on a soft, warm bed, sunlight shining on his face, which still showed a trace of daze from the after-effects. He sat up in the luxurious bedroom, bewildered, wondering when he had passed out. Adrian held his forehead and massaged his temples, admitting he had underestimated the endurance limits of this weak, mortal body. Memories flooded back to when he was a sword, having fought alongside legends like the Sword Saint or the Mercenary King. He recalled the bloody dragon-slaying battles, where he led heroes to glory and elevated their souls. The name Gruhorn was renowned as an outstanding strategist and a great teacher, but in reality, he was merely an outsider. Adrian stared at his hands, full of calluses and bruises, clearly feeling the painful price of possessing a human body. Adrian recalled the frenzied feeling of swinging a sword in the past, that intoxicating sensation of turning every effort into his own power. Returning to reality, he sat on the bed with a serious expression, realizing this weak body would soon collapse if he couldn't balance his mind and body. He began to regulate his breathing, confident that the mana accumulated over the past month was enough to advance to the next stage. Adrian closed his eyes and focused intensely. A stream of blue energy began to leak from his body, accompanied by a hissing sound. A notification panel appeared, confirming his persistent efforts had been rewarded with successful mana collection. The mana heart officially expanded. A fierce burst of blue energy enveloped his large back. Adrian stared at his hand, which was blazing with blue mana flames, satisfied that his body could now withstand more power. His body's structure was changing from within, every muscle, fiber, and blood vessel strengthened by the expanded mana heart. Adrian's eyes snapped open, flashing with sharp, powerful blue light. He sprang to his feet, his entire body enveloped in a brilliant blue aura, and he shouted excitedly, celebrating his success. Adrian gave a confident smirk as he glanced at the training sword propped in the corner of the room. His hand gripped the sword hilt decisively and powerfully. He swung the sword, creating a beautiful blue streak of light, and the system immediately recognized he had reached the sword apprentice level and could use basic aura. Looking at his proud reflection on the glowing blade, Adrian affirmed he had grasped the most fundamental aspects. The scene shifted to the training ground, where Count Vale was grumbling about the widespread rumors in the kingdom while Adrian listened with an innocent, guiltless expression. The uncle looked extremely annoyed and bothered by his precious nephew's reckless bet. Adrian feigned bewilderment for a second, then let out an ah sound when the uncle urged him to find an opponent for a duel. A cunning smile appeared on Adrian's face as he immediately thought of the second prince, whom he had targeted from the start. He suggested to his uncle that he warm up by beating up some single-chain individuals first, as he wasn't skilled enough to immediately take on two-chain opponents. Adrian turned to call Carl, the escort knight, to ask about what he had requested to be prepared earlier. Carl presented the list of those who had sent challenge requests with the devoted expression of a loyal retainer. The escort knight worriedly asked again if Adrian truly intended to spar with these people, or if he was joking. Carl warned that most of them harbored resentment, and would seize this opportunity to deal with the prince under the guise of a spar. Adrian gave a confident smirk, asserting he was well aware of the schemes of those small fries. He turned to his uncle Vale and requested him to personally officiate the upcoming match. Adrian picked up the training sword and chuckled, asking his uncle to provide protection to ensure no one disappeared during the skirmish. A few days later, Taylor Tailheim appeared, his face drenched in sweat, as he stood before the appointed hour. The magnificent palace of the Grand Prince stood majestically, a place Taylor called the Scoundrel's Lair. Taylor clutched the challenge letter, introducing himself as the second son of an ordinary baron's family. He recalled the grudge from a few years ago, when the old Adrian was laughing boisterously and pointing at his family. In that memory, Adrian had humiliated Taylor's father and elder brother, calling them country bumpkins right in the middle of the royal banquet. His family's honor, trampled into the dirt, caused Taylor to harbor a deep-seated grudge against Adrian Leon Burke to this very day. Returning to the present, Taylor bowed to Adrian, his eyes burning with hatred, vowing to make him pay dearly for that day. He drew his sword, solemnly introducing himself as a single-chain apprentice knight, and declaring his use of his inherited family sword style. Adrian stood picking his nose, disparaging his opponent as overly flashy and pathetic, utterly lacking any knightly demeanor. Taylor saw red, enraged that the worthless prince still maintained his arrogant habit of looking down on everyone. Count Vale immediately intervened with an overwhelming aura, demanding Taylor retract his killing intent before the match even began. The moment he saw Vale, Taylor's attitude did a complete 180-degree turn, his face flushing red like a maiden meeting her idol. He bowed 90 degrees to the Count with utmost respect, completely ignoring the prince standing right beside him. Adrian watched the ironic scene with a speechless expression, wondering who the main character of this duel truly was. Vale frowned, reminding Adrian to behave properly, while his nephew merely grimaced at having old matters brought up. Without further delay, Vale ordered both to take their positions and declared the match officially started. Taylor and Adrian pointed their swords at each other, one burned with killing intent, eager to devour his opponent alive, while the other's face remained as stoic as stone. Taylor immediately activated his mana, enveloping his entire body in a brilliant blue aura to display his overwhelming power. He flashed a sneering smile, uttering a challenge to Adrian before unleashing a decisive blow to finish the fight quickly and cleanly. Taylor lunged forward with dizzying speed, feigning a warning for Adrian to be careful, yet striking directly without mercy. A sharp, clanging collision echoed, and dust flew everywhere as the two swords struck hard against each other in the training ground. Looking down from above, Adrian remained unfazed, steadily parrying his opponent's lightning-fast slash with ease. Adrian curled his lip in a sneer of contempt, his sharp, cold gaze bluntly declaring that his opponent's movements were overly superfluous and cumbersome. He swung his sword, deflecting Taylor's attack, and creating a shockwave that sent his opponent flying backward in astonishment. Taylor's eyes widened in shock, unable to believe that someone using a mana heart could so easily block his mana chain. The recoil force pushed Taylor back a long distance, his feet tearing up the surface of the training ground to maintain his balance. He struggled to stop, his heels sliding across the ground, creating trails of swirling dust and an ear-splitting screech. Taylor stood panting heavily, trying to find an excuse that Adrian had only managed to block the attack by luck because he possessed only a single mana ring. Adrian nonchalantly looked at the sword in his hand, delivering a highly cutting taunt that his hand was only slightly numb. Taylor broke out in a cold sweat, his face revealing extreme bewilderment at the worthless prince's utterly indifferent attitude. The knights watching from outside suddenly jumped, startled by a strange sound emanating from the sword. Vale's expression changed, his eyes widening in horror as he recognized it as the legendary sword resonance phenomenon, achievable only by masters. The sword in his hand vibrated violently, and Taylor gritted his teeth, refusing to accept the harsh truth unfolding before his eyes. He screamed in despair, denying reality, and continuing to charge into the attack like a mad moth to a flame. Taylor gnashed his teeth, pouring all his strength into his sword. But Adrian remained as unmoving as a boulder, frustrating him to the extreme. Refusing to accept the truth, Taylor screamed wildly and slashed his sword haphazardly like a madman, desperately searching for a faint glimmer of hope. Adrian moved lightly, evading each sword strike filled with killing intent. Even as Taylor recklessly burned his blue mana in despair, the two swords clashed, creating a blinding explosion of light that kicked up dust, and shockwaves spread throughout the training ground. Adrian's feet slid across the ground, tearing up the tiled surface to neutralize the powerful thrust from the recent impact. Taylor stood panting like an ox from exhaustion, while Adrian maintained a proud stance and looked at him with disdain. Sweat began to roll down Adrian's cheek as he realized the theory of intense conflict between the mana ring and the mana heart was entirely accurate. He clutched his throbbing chest, feeling the chaotic mana flow that could cause a dangerous mana backlash at any moment. Taylor glared at his opponent with a distorted expression. He couldn't believe he was being cornered into such a humiliating predicament by a former fat guy. Adrian pointed the tip of his sword forward, curling his lip as he advised that brat from the Talheim family to cool his hot head. He closed his eyes, discarding all ambient noise to focus entirely on the screaming senses within his body. Adrian's mind sank deep into a silent space, feeling as if his body was free-falling to the deepest ocean floor of his subconscious. His eyes burst open within the waters of his mind, gleaming with a cold blue light and an authoritative awakening command. A colossal black dragon appeared in his subconscious, reminding him of the true nature of the demonic or holy sword he once possessed. Adrian reached out to touch that distant memory, asserting that, no matter what it was called, it remained an immortal part of his soul. The system announced that the mana heart had accepted his immense will, and began to imbue the colorless energy source with a new color. The dragon's eye glowed brightly in the darkness, awakening the brutal dragon-slaying will that had slumbered deep within his soul for so long. The image of a sword plunged into a dragon's heart loomed, connecting his most recent combat memory with the essence of his current heart. The Dragon Slayer heart officially activated, pumping out a brilliant red energy that tore through his mental space and spilled into reality. Taylor trembled violently, his face drained of all color, as he saw the colossal red dragon phantom roaring with killing intent behind Adrian. Count Balorhard screamed in alarm as he realized the deadly killing intent surging from his nephew. Adrian swung his sword with fiery eyes, the blade leaving a trail of crimson energy that tore through the wind, rushing forth like death itself. The uncle panicked and shouted, demanding it stop, but the destructive sword thrust could no longer be retracted. The terrifying surge of power from the sword made everyone exclaim that the weapon was far too dangerous. Earlier, Adrian had taken the opportunity to ask his uncle a small favor, with an extremely serious expression before the match began. He instructed that if he accidentally delivered a fatal blow to his opponent, his uncle should intervene immediately. A gigantic phantom appeared behind Adrian, signaling the destructive power about to be unleashed upon the training ground. Count Balorhard was forced to exert his full power, activating his surging blue aura to block this insane attack. The two streams of energy collided, creating a terrifying explosion that shook the entire space and sent everything flying. As the dust settled, the uncle stood firm with his sword wreathed in blue lightning, while Adrian had been knocked far, far away. Adrian sat slumped against the shattered wall, his head bowed, unconscious after the extremely powerful collision. Count Balorhard calmly sheathed his sword with a crisp click, displaying the demeanor of a superior. The royal knights immediately surrounded the uncle, pointing their swords at him, believing the count had just assassinated the prince. The uncle coldly ordered them to stand down and explained that Adrian himself had asked him to do so to prevent a catastrophe. Adrian scrambled to his feet, wiped the blood from his mouth, and confirmed his uncle's words were true, to the astonishment of the soldiers. He secretly blamed his uncle for hitting a bit too hard. Even though he asked him to block the attack, he didn't say to knock him out completely. His exhausted body made him fall heavily to the ground once more, just as he was about to stand up. Inside his chest, his mana heart was pounding and emitting an intense blue light, as if about to explode. Adrian clutched his chest, panting and sweating profusely, feeling as if his heart was about to burst after the powerful recoil. He realized the vast difference in class after taking the full force of a quad-chain knight's attack. Fortunately, his stout body could still endure it. Adrian Leon Burke woke up with a cheerful smile, clenching his fist and congratulating himself on winning the duel, even though in reality, he had been knocked unconscious. He was chuckling to himself when he was startled to see his uncle sitting imposingly in the room, asking what he was so happy about. The uncle stood up with a stern expression, interrogating his precious nephew about what mischief he had caused to create the recent mess. He still hadn't recovered from his shock, recalling that crimson, sinister killing intent, and grumbled that he had never taught such barbaric swordsmanship. Adrian Leonberg calmly replied with an innocent expression that he was merely being true to the core essence of swordsmanship. The uncle frowned skeptically, sarcastically remarking that someone who had never truly tasted the battlefield knew nothing about the essence of swordsmanship. However, he also admitted that the raw killing intent Adrian Leonberg displayed, though unpleasant and cruel, was an undeniable truth. Adrian Leonberg's eyes widened in surprise, as he hadn't expected this rigid uncle to possess such an open and pragmatic mindset. The uncle curled his lip into a sneer, saying he thought his nephew would drone on about some empty platitudes, like the path of the sword being perfection or something. He asserted that he was a soldier who valued practical victory, rather than a knight who only chased after fanciful righteous ideals. Adrian Leonberg listened in silence, his gaze becoming serious, as he realized this uncle was far more profound than he had imagined. Nevertheless, the uncle still sternly warned that if the killing intent was too great, the swordsman would be consumed, and no longer able to distinguish friend from foe. Adrian Leonberg pouted like a scolded child, immediately guessing his uncle's intention was to use this opportunity to re-educate him. The uncle crossed his arms and declared he would closely supervise to see if his nephew would be consumed by the demon in his mind. 3 days of hellish training passed quickly, marked by the image of a sword plunged into the ground, signaling the end of the torment. Taylor Talheim stood panting heavily, his hands trembling as he leaned on his sword, looking as battered as if he had just emerged from a meat grinder after 3 days of torment. In contrast, Adrian Leonberg shouldered his sword with a radiant expression, praising his opponent for performing well as a sandbag over the past 3 days. It turned out that poor young man had to strain himself to block Adrian Leonberg's sword attacks, filled with insane killing intent, for 3 consecutive days. He further teased that Taylor Talheim must be terribly regretting not being able to land a single punch on him to vent his anger, making the young man only able to stammer. Adrian Leonberg turned and ordered the maid to bring the mysterious wooden chest, preparing to bestow a reward upon his loyal sandbag. Adrian Leonberg received the heavy wooden chest from the maid's hands with a rarely seen serious expression. He handed the chest to Taylor Talheim, admitting his wretched past while the shadow of his greedy former self haunted him. Taylor Talheim blankly received the compensation gift, consisting of gold and a letter for his father, his face flushing red because he couldn't believe his eyes. Adrian Leonberg saw off his guest with a smile full of hidden meaning, secretly calculating his next moves to clear his reputation. Taylor Talheim teared up and thanked him profusely, while Adrian Leonberg told himself this was just fair payment for the training sandbag. Rumors about the training match spread quickly throughout the kingdom like wildfire. Everyone thought the useless prince had dug his own grave due to his arrogance. The servants in the castle gathered, laughing and mocking, betting on how much humiliation that arrogant prince would suffer from this incident. But several days passed without any sensational news, and Taylor Talheim appeared with a calm expression, leaving everyone dumbfounded. He began to recount the story with a rosy filter, praising Adrian Leonberg as noble and claiming the match took place peacefully, full of affection. The noble youth's faces went blank with shock after hearing it, extremely bewildered because the story was too fabricated compared to reality. Rumors spread wildly that the royal family had silenced the witness, causing Adrian Leonberg to furiously slam the table, almost breaking it in half. He indignantly roared that the man only kept quiet out of shame for losing, and there was no bizarre political conspiracy whatsoever. While Adrian Leonberg was cursing the idle nobles, his uncle, standing behind him, immediately threw a bucket of cold water in his face. He flinched, cold sweat pouring down as he recognized his uncle's familiar killing intent and scrutinizing gaze right behind his neck. It turned out that before leaving, Adrian Leonberg had used friendly force to squeeze Taylor Talheim's shoulder, threatening him to announce the match results to the public. He was convinced that his plan to use real people and real events to crush the false rumors was flawless, without a single loophole. However, the harsh reality stunned Adrian Leonberg, leaving him dumbfounded, unable to understand where the mistake was in this herding sheep process. The trembling maid reported that people were spreading rumors that he had threatened his opponent to falsify the match results, turning white into black. Adrian Leonberg exhaled sharply, his face darkening at the irony of life, where good intentions led to resentment, and his already ruined reputation was now even worse. Blue mana erupted around him, and he decided to ignore the world, pulling out his wooden sword to continue training furiously to vent his frustration. Adrian swung his wooden sword, tearing through the wind, creating a sharp, blue sword aura that sliced through space. His eyes blazed, pouring all his strength into the strike, as if to unleash all his vexation into the void. The wind howled with each powerful and decisive swing of the fat prince's sword. He continued to unleash an incredibly powerful vertical slash, its terrifying acceleration making the surrounding air tremble. The sword tip striking the ground created an explosive blue mana aftershock, proving his current arm strength was no joke. Adrian panted heavily, his mana heart in his chest glowing brightly like an overloaded nuclear reactor after the combo sequence. He turned to ask Carl how many sandbags were left, and the knight reported the situation. Adrian wiped his sweat, declaring that the apprentice knights were now mere small fry, not enough to even warm him up. Carl sternly announced that today's final challenger was a genuine, well-trained knight. This was not someone who merely pranced around at home, but a talent who had joined a prestigious knight order for training. Adrian smirked with interest upon hearing the title, Apprentice Knight of the Iron Lion Knights. Carl loudly announced the name of the next formidable opponent, Reincarnation. A female knight with long black hair stepped into the arena, her cold, overwhelming aura causing the atmosphere to grow heavy. The guards whispered amongst themselves, knowing immediately from the emblem on her armor that she was a genuine article from the esteemed Iron Lion Knights. She was dubbed the Flower on the Cliff, or the Thorned Rose, one who had shattered the hearts of countless weak men. Her steps halted decisively, exuding the confidence and iron discipline of a true noble. The guards began to indulge in their infatuation, surprised that such an exquisite beauty would come to this place herself. One soldier admitted that the prince also had a knack for attracting talent, albeit in some bizarre way. He concluded with a sarcastic remark that it would be truly laughable if the prince were thoroughly beaten by this beauty in front of everyone. Reincarnation stood proudly in her blue armor, asserting the caliber of a genius who had already secured a formal position in the Knight Order. Adrian was bewildered, not understanding why a sword genius would idly come to challenge him to a solo duel. The royal knight leaned in and whispered, explaining that the prince had once incurred the beautiful lady's enmity in the past. He turned to ask a nearby maid what exactly his former self had done. The maid broke out in a cold sweat, stammering and not daring to expose her master. The knight concluded with a blunt statement that he had once harassed Arwen. Adrian clutched his head, feeling like it would explode, silently cursing his former self as a truly irredeemable scoundrel. Dark memories flooded back, showing him attempting to grope and proposition Arwen to become his personal maid. Arwen unceremoniously slapped that filthy hand away with utmost disdain. She coldly declared that a knight was not a toy for him to casually possess. The fat pig, embarrassed, turned furious, stomping his feet and yelling insults about her beauty like an immature brat. Adrian's face darkened upon hearing the story, appalled by the stupidity of his former self. He admitted that it was indeed the perverse courtship script of a genuine piece of trash. Seeing Arwen standing tall in the arena, who would believe that someone dared to call her ugly? To criticize such exquisite beauty truly meant one was blind or had severe brain damage. Arwen offered a polite bow, but her tone was as cold as an ancient iceberg. Adrian scratched his head and gave an awkward laugh, trying to appear friendly and compliment her on not changing at all. Inside, he was screaming that he had completely changed, even his very soul. Arwen's sharp gaze sent shivers down his spine, and he accepted this as karma he had to pay. Count Balorhard suddenly appeared with a dignified demeanor, causing the crowd to part. He was stunned to see Arwen solemnly perform the military salute to him. The royal uncle warned Arwen to be careful of Adrian's treacherous sword, but she retorted coldly, asking where he had sold his neutrality. Ignoring his niece's insolent attitude, the royal uncle simply closed his eyes and signaled for the match to begin. Adrian flashed a confident, challenging smile, while Arwen took a defensive stance, her eyes as sharp as razors. In the vast arena, the royal uncle raised his hand high and loudly, declared the start of the decisive duel. The moment he finished speaking, Arwen shot forth like a wind-piercing arrow, leaving a faint afterimage behind. Adrian remained still, observing, a smirk on his lips, eager to gauge the true skill of the Iron Lion prodigy. Arwen leaped into the air, delivering a lightning-fast strike imbued with blue mana down upon her opponent. Adrian's blue eye flashed. He activated his hyper-focus and admitted her movements were quite good. The two swords clashed, creating a deafening clang, and sparks flew as Adrian parried the direct attack. Adrian gritted his teeth in endurance, his face contorted as the mana flow in his body began to surge backward, causing him pain. Seizing the opportunity, Arwen pressed her advantage relentlessly, her eyes gleaming with cold, deadly resolve. The dry clang of metal echoed as Adrian struggled to parry against the female swordswoman's overwhelming power. Arwen wielded her sword like a storm, unleashing a barrage of continuous slashes that left Adrian only able to huddle in desperate defense. Sweat poured off him like rain. Adrian realized he was being completely outmaneuvered, and that this situation was extremely dire. Arwen gathered brilliant blue mana into her sword, preparing to unleash a finishing blow to send the prince to his demise. In that critical moment, the Dragon Slayer heart in Adrian's chest activated, erupting with a blazing red aura that enveloped him. Sensing the sudden, terrifying killing intent, Arwen's eyes widened in astonishment, and cold sweat trickled down her spine. A surge of crimson power erupted, blocking Arwen's attack and creating a powerful shockwave that threw everything back. Arwen was flung far back. She had to somersault in midair to avoid the surging red aura swirling around Adrian. Landing gracefully, Arwen took a highly vigilant stance before the monster that had just awakened within the guise of the Fat Prince. Arwen broke out in a cold sweat, her eyes wavering intensely as she realized the sword in her opponent's hand exuded an extraordinary aura. Adrian sneered arrogantly, admitting that this girl was indeed the real deal, not like the trashy small fry out there. His system eye activated. The formidable power of judgment was ready to scrutinize every piece of his opponent's information. The status window appeared, glowing green, revealing Arwen to be an A-rank sword prodigy with a terrifying skill set. Adrian spat out a mouthful of blood, his eyes, blazing red like a demon's, fixed firmly on his prey with intense determination. He gleefully realized that being able to see her stats meant her skill level was only on par with, or even weaker than his. Without another word, Arwen erupted with surging blue mana and charged forward like a living lightning bolt to attack. Adrian glided to evade the attack, having already calculated the scenario to turn the tide of this match based on the information he had just appraised. The two surges of red and blue power clashed, creating a shocking explosion. Adrian struck down from above, while Arwen desperately parried the blow. Adrian stood panting heavily like an ox, drenched in sweat after the terrifying collision, but still stood firm. On the other side, Arwen was no better off. She gasped for breath, her knight's armor seeming to have become impossibly heavy. Under the twilight glow, the two warriors glared at each other from a distance, neither willing to fall despite their depleted stamina. A sword suddenly flew and plunged into the ground, cutting through the tense atmosphere of the match. The royal uncle stepped forward with a stern expression, declaring the match stopped here and rescheduled for tomorrow. Adrian wiped his mouth, clicking his tongue in regret, then took the opportunity to boast that he had almost finished the match. Arwen was not one to be outdone. She retorted with a faint smile that she herself had been about to send him on his way. Their eyes sparked with electricity as they glared at each other, both itching to continue their duel to settle the score. The royal uncle roared with authority, immediately extinguishing the desperate intentions of his two belligerent young relatives. The royal uncle sternly ordered for both of them to receive immediate treatment, as it was too late to continue playing. The old royal physician rushed to Adrian, his hands glowing with a blue light, chattering incessantly as he asked to treat the prince. Adrian grimaced as the old physician treated the bruises on his face. Despite the pain, he tried to maintain an indifferent expression. He glanced to the side, seeing Arwen also being healed under the blue light of recovery magic. Arwen gritted her teeth in frustration, drenched in sweat because she couldn't finish off the Fat Prince on the very first day. Both turned their backs to each other, sullenly ending the martial arts exchange with neither willing to concede to the other. Each went their separate way towards the castle. In Arwen's mind, the determination for revenge still burned, refusing to accept defeat. The battle thus dragged on persistently, with no clear victor, causing the entire royal palace to watch with bated breath for several days straight. By the third day, the guarding knights began to break out in a cold sweat, seeing that these two monsters still refused to stop. A soldier had to nod in agreement that even if Arwen was a prodigy, the prince's skills were no less formidable. Under the twilight sun of the third day, Arwen once again carried her sword to the arena, hoping today would be the day to finalize the outcome. Adrian unexpectedly flashed a sly smile, raising his hand to ask for a brief pause before diving into the next desperate round. Arwen frowned suspiciously, immediately cutting him off, thinking he was about to use flowery apologies to evade punishment as usual. Her gaze was sharp as a knife, and she flatly declared that an apology would be useless at this moment. Adrian shrugged and sneered, saying she was worrying needlessly because he had no intention of stooping to such a shameful level. He narrowed his eyes calculatingly, suggesting that a fierce fight like this required a reward to truly stimulate the spirit. Adrian raised the stakes by proposing that the loser must fulfill any single wish requested by the winner. Arwen froze for a few seconds, sweating profusely at the sheer arrogance and excessive confidence of the fat man before her. The royal knights frantically tried to intervene, fearing the prince might carelessly promise something foolish that would disgrace the royal family. Adrian completely ignored the soldiers, clamoring like a broken market, focusing solely on Arwen, awaiting her final answer. Arwen sheathed her sword, accepting the challenge with the demeanor of a subordinate, yet filled with pride and killing intent. Arwen smirked confidently, declaring bluntly that if she won, she must also receive a worthy reward from the prince. Adrian praised his opponent's decent thinking, while a stream of blazing red aura began enveloping his body, signaling the start of the game. Both charged at each other like moths to a flame, Adrian shouting loudly to remind his opponent not to go back on her word after losing. He unleashed sword strikes as fast as lightning, forcing Arwen to strain her eyes just to parry the blows in astonishment. Refusing to be outdone, she swung her sword down in an arc carrying blue lightning to counterattack. Adrian flashed a demonic smile, his eyes glowing, fiery red like headlights, signaling that serious mode had been activated. A terrifying collision erupted, and Adrian's overwhelming power forced Arwen to grit her teeth and endure the immense pressure. She broke out in a cold sweat, realizing in panic that the speed of this fat man had increased illogically compared to yesterday. The silhouette of a gigantic black dragon appeared behind Adrian. The tyrannical aura made Arwen wonder how well he had hidden his true abilities. The two continuously exchanged techniques in midair, creating streaks of red and blue light that tore through the surrounding space. Arwen began to tire, crying out in pain as Adrian's relentless red-hued attacks shattered her defense. Adrian glided like the wind, swinging his sword to generate tremendous pressure that swept away all obstacles on the arena floor. The genius female knight was now panting heavily like an ox, drenched in sweat because she could not keep up with the battle's frantic pace. Adrian poured all his strength into his arm, his sharp eyes preparing to unleash a powerful finishing blow from above. The sword, carrying the weight of 1,000 pounds, struck down mercilessly toward his opponent's head, tearing through the air. A deafening explosion rang out, accompanied by a powerful shockwave that kicked up thick dust around the point of impact. Arwen's weapon was knocked high into the air, spinning like a pinwheel before plunging miserably into the ground. Arwen knelt on the ground in helplessness, completely subdued by Adrian's overwhelming power, while he calmly sheathed his sword. The royal knights watching from the sidelines could only gape, utterly speechless at the unbelievable result that had just unfolded before their eyes. The royal uncle stared wide-eyed, his aged face etched with extreme astonishment at the unexpected outcome. Arwen trembled, sweat pouring down her body, stammering as she refused to believe the harsh reality that she had been defeated. Adrian loudly declared victory in the wager, while his opponent remained kneeling, dazed, at his feet. He called out Reincarnation's name directly, standing tall like a mountain, creating invisible pressure that weighed heavily on the young woman. Adrian flashed a triumphant and cunning half-smile, preparing to state the demand of the superior. Arwen flushed crimson, her eyes wide open when she heard Adrian bluntly state the two words. He wanted her, right there in broad daylight. Memories flooded back to the blonde guard, who had once been assigned to protect the kingdom's most notorious prince. The guard bowed politely, secretly worrying about his future, serving someone rumored to be a good-for-nothing. Adrian sat leaning on the throne with a nonchalant expression. Though arrogant, he was neither crazy nor destructive as rumored. The guard was astonished to see Adrian carrying his bulky body, running fiercely to train his physique instead of indulging in pleasure. The guard's gaze gradually changed, realizing that the rumors about the prince's laziness were complete garbage. Under the pouring rain, Adrian persistently swung his wooden sword at the training post, displaying an iron will rarely seen in a noble. The knight standing outside whispered worriedly, intending to rush in and stop him, fearing the prince would fall ill in the harsh weather. The guard screamed a warning when he sensed a fiercely dangerous aura erupting from Adrian. A sharp explosion echoed, the terrifying force from Adrian's strike crushing the wooden post into hundreds of fragments. Adrian turned back with a savage smile, his eyes blazing with excitement amidst the ruins he had just created in the downpour. The guard was stunned, his pupils contracting from the shock of the terrifying latent power the prince had just revealed. Amidst the rain, the guard had been certain that Adrian would become an outstanding great man, a magnificent individual. Returning to the present, Adrian's final demand to possess Arwen completely shattered the guard's illusion, making him think the prince was a lecher. The royal knights gasped, viewing the prince's proposal as a shocking scandal that left them speechless. The guard broke out in a cold sweat, wondering if he had misjudged Adrian's true character upon hearing those audacious words. Arwen trembled with humiliation, unable to believe her ears at the bizarre request she considered an insult to a knight's honor. She shot up, her eyes blazing with furious anger, questioning if that was truly the perverted desire of this prince. Adrian poured cold water on her, sarcastically remarking that she was merely an ordinary apprentice knight, who couldn't even defeat a prince known as trash. He smirked arrogantly, beginning to reveal what he truly coveted from the girl before him. Adrian declared loudly that what he wished to possess was the boundless potential and future of Knight Arwen Kyrgyzstan. Arwen froze, her eyes wide with astonishment, as she realized she had completely misunderstood the intentions of this fat prince. Adrian asserted that he needed a sharp sword, someone willing to risk their life to follow him, not merely for show. The guard flinched when he heard the prince discard loyalty based on empty royal decrees, demanding absolute devotion instead. Under the brilliant sunset, Adrian concluded that he wanted to possess a knight who belonged to him and him alone. Activating his judgment ability, Adrian scrutinized her dreamlike status window, which displayed the sword prodigy talent. He saw through his opponent's heart with sharp, blue eyes, preparing to deliver a decisive psychological blow to win over the talented individual. Arwen was stunned, her mind in turmoil as she heard the weighty invitation. Become Adrian's personal knight. Memories flooded back. Arwen recalled the moment she achieved her dream of donning knight's armor, but reality was harsh. In the past, she had to swing her sword frantically, amidst the prejudiced whispers and gossip of the men around her. Even drenched in sweat, her beautiful appearance still made shallow people point and gossip, instead of acknowledging her talent. Dismissed as a mere flower vase, Arwen unleashed her fury into devastating slashes that shattered her targets, working twice as hard as others. She had swept aside every opponent in her apprentice class, achieving overwhelming victories to prove her strength. Yet she remained unrecognized. In her memory, Arwen furiously parried the male opponent's sword, her eyes burning with determination to prove herself on the training ground. She unleashed a sword strike imbued with wind-rending blue mana, sending the male trainee flying meters away with absolute overwhelming power. Despite her victory, all she received was a lonely back amidst the whispers of the men in the academy, who still saw her as a mere flower vase. Returning to reality, Arwen trembled, cold sweat breaking out as she recalled the helplessness and humiliation she faced due to those cruel societal prejudices. She was astonished to realize that Adrian wasn't looking at her beauty, but coveted her potential and future as a true knight. Adrian looked directly into his opponent's eyes with terrifying seriousness, awaiting an answer from the prey that had taken the bait. In the sun-drenched arena, Arwen made a bold request before accepting the fat prince's offer. She choked out a plea, asking Adrian to promise to treat her as a true knight, not a weak woman. If Adrian met that condition, Arwen swore to dedicate the rest of her life to serving him. Their gazes met. Adrian saw through his opponent's heart, while Arwen found a new spark of hope in his resolute eyes. Adrian smirked confidently, immediately accepting this weighty vow without hesitation. Decisive footsteps echoed. Arwen cast aside all hesitation to step towards her new destiny. Immediately, the female swordswoman knelt on one knee, bowing her head in submission to her new master. Adrian smiled triumphantly as he heard Arwen loudly declare her identity and swear absolute loyalty to him. The royal knights and the royal uncle froze behind them, unable to believe their eyes at this shocking display of winning hearts. Royal Uncle Vale Balorhard silently observed, his eyes revealing a complex mix of respect and admiration for his nephew's regal aura. Adrian placed the sword on Arwen's shoulder, officially performing the knighting ceremony in the name of the family's legitimate heir. He solemnly imparted teachings on courage and chivalry to his new knight, in a posture full of dignity. Under the crimson sunset, Adrian concluded with the most important command: loyalty, thus completing the recruitment of a capable subordinate. The young nobles began to gather and buzz with chatter, unable to believe that a knight would swear loyalty to this infamous prince. The gossips eagerly spun tales, suspecting Arwen had a shady relationship, or was Adrian's mistress, which was why she performed this vow. Adrian clutched his head and yelled in frustration, wondering if he was a villainous overlord, since he always got a bad reputation wherever he went. He turned and roared at Carl with extreme helplessness, realizing his reputation in the eyes of the world was nothing but trash. Carl merely stood silently, enduring the outburst, his face impassive, not bothering to respond to his master's emotional explosion. Waiting for Adrian to vent his anger, Carl calmly spoke, calling him back to the main issue. The royal knight unexpectedly recalled the cryptic remark Adrian had made during their previous life-or-death duel. Memories flooded back, making Adrian recall the moment he had declared he didn't need someone who only protected him due to royal orders. Carl looked Adrian straight in the eyes, posing a critical question about whether he would obey if the royal family ordered him transferred elsewhere. Adrian smirked mischievously, teasing that if Carl wished, he could allow him to make his vow of loyalty right now. Carl showed a flicker of confusion, hesitantly asking in return if Adrian would truly accept if he agreed to swear the vow. Immediately, Adrian turned away abruptly, and coldly uttered a blunt no, leaving his opponent dumbfounded. He added another blow to Carl's spirit, bluntly criticizing that nurturing him offered no interest, because he was too rigid. Carl forced a strained smile, even as veins pulsed on his forehead from Adrian's public provocation. Adrian maintained his serious expression, asserting that his recent criticisms were entirely true and not a joke. Suddenly, a royal letter arrived, announcing that Adrian's house arrest was officially lifted and he was required to attend the upcoming banquet. Adrian scratched his head in confusion, wondering what on earth he had done to be released a full month and a half earlier than expected. He shivered, recalling his father the king's terrifying expression, who had once threatened to lock him in the palace until his bones rotted, never seeing the light of day. Adrian shook his head in resignation as he walked, admitting he was completely clueless about the unpredictable schemes of the kingdom's ruler. Adrian turned away with an indifferent expression, admitting he had no refuge or acquaintances outside the palace, so he simply didn't care. A maid rushed in frantically, holding an urgent letter as if the house was on fire. The maid bowed her head in apology for interrupting the tense atmosphere, tremblingly presenting the invitation card that had just arrived for the prince. Adrian raised an eyebrow skeptically, looking puzzled upon hearing the two unfamiliar words invitation card. The card was handed directly to him, with a family crest depicting a helmet and a sword printed extremely formally on the envelope. He read the words social club for special young lords, with an expression full of skepticism and disdain. Adrian was dumbfounded, pointing at his own face when the maid confirmed he used to be a core member of this club. The maid broke out in a cold sweat, stammering and not daring to speak directly about the true nature of that bizarre club. Memories flooded back, showing the old obese prince indulging in debauchery with wine and women, a sight that would make anyone feel disgusted. Adrian unceremoniously tore the invitation to shreds, dismissing this useless gathering to focus on leveling up and training. Suddenly, his gaze froze and his pupils contracted when he noticed an unusual detail on the shredded paper. The signature eternal friend Bernardo of the Eli family made him pay close attention. Adrian picked up the piece of paper, rummaging through his memories about this unfamiliar Eli family name to see if it held any value. He recalled his uncle's words about the Eli family, fanatics of the mana heart to the very end, who had fallen centuries ago. Adrian abruptly changed his mind, ordering the maid to prepare his belongings to attend the banquet immediately. He clutched the piece of paper, secretly hoping that dilapidated family still held some exploitable value for his plans. 4 months passed since Adrian began his weight loss hell, and the royal tailor was exclaiming in admiration at the new outfit. The pitch-black outfit had a minimalist design, without any fuss or frills, exactly as he wished. Adrian stepped out with a completely transformed new appearance, a perfectly slender body, and a radiant aura, making the tailor exclaim in admiration. Adrian stood before the mirror, admiring the results of his rapid weight loss, which made the royal tailor gape in astonishment as his measurements had decreased by more than half. The tailor excitedly demanded to start tailoring the formal attire immediately, but Adrian raised a hand, signaling him to wait. He flashed a confident and arrogant smile, asserting that this body would undergo even more spectacular changes by the day of the banquet. A few days after his house arrest ended, Adrian's escort of carriages noisily advanced towards the social club for young nobles. The blonde guard rode at the head of the retinue with a highly vigilant expression, observing his surroundings. Sitting in the luxurious carriage, Adrian yawned repeatedly, complaining that this princely status was truly too tiring and troublesome. He felt suffocated to the point of madness with the elaborate clothes and the constantly hovering guards, while the maid sitting opposite him remained completely silent. Adrian's sharp gaze suddenly froze when he noticed something unusual on the girl opposite him. He called out, making the maid jump in fright, sweating profusely, fearing she was about to be reprimanded. Adrian narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the ugly raised scar located right on the girl's collarbone, a mark that shouldn't be there. The maid tremblingly covered the scar, stammering an apology for her own weakness and believing she deserved punishment. Adrian gritted his teeth as memories of his former useless, obese self resurfaced. It turned out he had bullied and caused that scar on her. Seeing the girl cowering in fear, he suddenly realized he had seen her for months without ever knowing her name. Adrian propped his leg on the seat with an overbearing demeanor, then bluntly asked for the identity of the maid, who was trembling like a leaf. The girl timidly introduced herself as Adelia Bayern, making Adrian's eyes widen in extreme surprise, as if he couldn't believe his ears. He pondered the surname Bayern, a family so small it was almost unknown on the current noble map. Adrian couldn't believe he was hearing this fated name in a place like this. Memories of history began to flood back. He recalled the ancient chaotic era, where weak humans were oppressed and plundered by other races like elves and dwarves. That was when saviors appeared, ending the Dark Age, those honored by humanity as the 5 electors. One of the 5 legendary heroes, the one called Gruhorn, smiled with a murderous aura in the crimson sunset. Agnes Bayern stood defiantly amidst the blazing battlefield, hand resting on her sword, asking about the war's end with an overwhelming aura. Facing her was an entire giant legion, looking utterly grotesque and ferocious, charging forward. The swordswoman's blazing golden eyes gleamed with a deadly gaze as she locked onto her target. A sword strike tore through the sky, descending like divine punishment, splitting both space and ground. She charged directly at the giant king boss with unstoppable speed and power from above. With a single clean slash, the head of the monster king Ida was severed from his neck, ending an era of exploitation. The one who had just performed that impossible feat was none other than the renowned iron-blooded sword marquis, Agnes Byrne. She exhaled sharply, her blood-stained face exuding the arrogance of an absolute victor. Standing amidst piles of monster corpses, she began to hurl insults at the defeated foes, calling them trash. Her eyes flashed again, her rage seemingly uncooled, continuing to erupt. Agnes Byrne charged in, slashing and killing, while cursing the monsters as filthy, scavenging cockroaches. She mocked the massive giants for having combat skills as pathetic as insects. Her sky-shattering roars denounced the cowardice of the monsters, who only knew how to bully the weak. Even the holy sword Gruhorn in her hand had to sweat profusely, trembling before its master's terrifyingly foul mouth. Back in reality, Adrian covered his ears tightly, his face contorted, as the memory of his ancestors' terribly foul language defiled his ears. He broke out in a cold sweat upon realizing that Maid was a descendant of that foul-mouthed monster. Looking at the innocent and bewildered Adelia, he couldn't understand why that domineering bloodline had been nerfed so miserably. His train of thought was interrupted when the carriage stopped, and the blonde guard opened the door, signaling their arrival. Adrian stepped out of the carriage with an arrogant demeanor. Just as the blonde guard opened the door, signaling the perfect moment, his high-quality leather shoes stomped firmly onto the tiled floor, the solid footsteps announcing the predator's presence. He pointed directly at Adelia's face, ordering her to wait there for him to settle accounts later, which made her jump in surprise. Adelia stood bewildered, with a myriad of questions, while the guard also broke out in a cold sweat at his master's incomprehensible attitude. A silver-haired man with a practiced smile appeared, eagerly welcoming Adrian with a familiar fawning tone. He introduced himself as Bernardo of the Eli family, placing a hand on his chest and bowing to Adrian in an overly theatrical, sickening manner. Adrian looked at the fop before him with contempt, secretly judging him as nothing more than a flashy, pretentious brat. Adrian's face hardened, his sharp, cold gaze scrutinizing the opponent, making the atmosphere intensely tense. Bernardo smirked, revealing the cunning nature hidden beneath his falsely polite exterior. Upon seeing Adrian's reaction, the silver-haired man feigned concern, asking about his health, but Adrian coldly brushed him off with a cryptic answer, leaving him dumbfounded. Adrian patted Bernardo's shoulder, flashed an ominous smile, and declared that thanks to him, there would be a good show to watch today. He swept past Bernardo arrogantly, leaving the silver-haired man rooted to the spot in confusion and doubt. Boisterous laughter echoed, pulling the viewers back to a debauched past filled with the smell of alcohol and women. The old, obese Adrian was groping a flirtatious woman, shamelessly boasting about his debauched exploits. He caressed the girl's skin with a lecherous expression, while she feigned flirtation to extract money. The entire room was filled with the smell of alcohol and debauchery, where nobles only knew how to flatter and indulge in pleasure with the commoners' tax money. Back in reality, Bernardo broke out in a cold sweat upon realizing the drastic change in the prince who was once a drunken good-for-nothing. Adrian sat enjoying a glass of wine with an overwhelming regal aura, completely unlike the ruined image in everyone's memories. A noble, red-faced from alcohol, staggered in, smirking lewdly, intending to strike up a conversation with Adrian. The drunken noble began to spew garbage about the Iron Lion's flower, with a lecherous expression. Adrian sat silently listening, his eyes as cold as if looking at an insect about to be crushed. He swirled his wineglass, regretting that he was too slow to claim the Nidus's vow before the rumors spread. His foul mouth continued to morbidly fantasize about the body beneath the iron armor, making the listeners nauseous. He turned to Adrian with a mocking expression, asking an inappropriate question about family matters to cover up his vulgarity. Bernardo Ailey froze upon hearing Adrian calmly confirm that he still had a younger brother with a mysterious smile. Wham! A mountain-shattering punch landed directly on the drunkard's face, instantly deforming his face. Adrian struck with lightning speed, the monoclad punch tearing through the air before anyone could react. The noble flew backward, blood and teeth scattering in a beautiful parabolic arc across the banquet hall. He crashed onto the floor, the wineglass shattering, creating a pathetic mess at Adrian's feet. The surrounding noble crowd gasped, their faces drained of color at the sudden violent spectacle. Bernardo Eli broke out in a cold sweat, his eyes flickering wildly upon realizing the prince's frenzied nature. Adrian flashed a deathly smile, offering sarcastic comfort that it was fortunate his family still had an heir. Thud. He delivered another sky-shattering kick to the defeated foe's stomach without mercy, making the floor tremble. Desperate screams echoed throughout the banquet hall, while Adrian stood towering, stomping on his opponent's chest like a malevolent deity. Adrian's eyes blazed with killing intent. He coldly declared that from now on, his younger brother at home would be the official heir. Still not satisfied, Adrian continued to raise his fist, pouring all his strength into the next punitive blow. Thwack! The ironclad fist once again intimately kissed the unfortunate noble's already mangled face. The noble spectators trembled, utterly terrified by the brutal torture and overwhelming aura of the monster disguised as a prince. Bernardo, Eli, and the noble beside him turned pale, sweating profusely upon witnessing Adrian's explosive madness. Adrian's hand clamped tightly onto his opponent's collar like an iron vice, giving the prey no chance to struggle. A mountain-shattering punch landed squarely on the drunkard's face, making him shriek miserably and demand to know why he was being beaten so savagely. The nobleman's face was swollen like a waterlogged bun, while Adrian coldly ordered him to open his ears and listen carefully. Adrian glared, declaring that he could accept being considered trash, but would absolutely not forgive anyone who dared to treat him like trash. The crowd of nobles stood bewildered, exchanging glances with countless question marks above their heads, completely unable to process the prince's overbearing logic. Adrian delivered another thunderous punch to his opponent's face to help him understand the definition of respect through violence. The nobleman flew backward, tearing up the floor under the overwhelming power of the monster in human skin. Adrian stood proudly, with his head bowed in the middle of the banquet hall, surrounded by the terrified gazes of Bernardo, Eli, and the stunned audience. The nobleman lay motionless on the floor, his face completely disfigured, eyes rolled back, officially out of the game. Bernardo Eli was so terrified his limbs went limp, collapsing to the floor the moment he heard Adrian call his name in a deathly voice. Adrian flashed a savage smile, a streak of blood on his cheek, gloatingly reiterating his earlier prophecy of a joyous, bloody day. Bernardo Eli broke out in a cold sweat, his mind screaming in panic, unable to comprehend why this mad prince had changed so drastically. Adrian stood towering like a terrifying figure, ordering Bernardo Eli to immediately summon the royal knights. Bernardo Eli sprang up like a coiled spring, stammering his obedience before rushing off to carry out the task, desperate to escape the suffocating pressure. The entire grand banquet hall was plunged into a deadly silence, with only Adrian's solitary yet authoritative figure standing in the center. The door slammed shut, and Adrian turned, his sharp eyes still lingering with deadly killing intent. He coldly waved his hand, dismissing all the women from the room to clear the scene and prepare for the next purge. In a hidden corner, the royal uncle, with a long scar across his eye, squinted, observing all developments with a look of doubt and calculation. The noble's legs trembled, unconsciously retreating from the terrifying pressure emanating from Adrian. Adrian cast a murderous glance, reminding the nobleman in blue that he only permitted women to leave, not cowardly men. He provocatively raised a hand, bluntly declaring that anyone who walked out the door now was no different from a woman. Adrian stomped his foot directly onto the chest of a nobleman lying on the floor, making him shriek miserably like a pig being slaughtered. The resolute footsteps of armed forces echoed outside, signaling that the hour of judgment had arrived. In his memory, these nobles had never knelt or shown any minimal respect for a prince. Adrian recalled the scene where the red-faced nobleman had dared to mock and insult him right to his face. Adrian's eyes were sharp as knives as he mentioned the gravest offense, daring to insult his knight, Arwen. Adrian turned his back to the door, coldly asking his subordinates what crime this insolent behavior deserved. The door burst open, and the royal knights entered, asserting that disrespecting the royal family was an unforgivable insult. The pampered young masters' faces drained of color, their mouths agape as they realized the situation had spiraled out of control. The blonde guard boldly declared that this act of challenging royal authority was nothing short of treason. Two knights stood tall behind Adrian, awaiting their master's command to force anyone to kneel in submission. Adrian flashed a savage and satisfied smile, seeing that his trap of power had perfectly sprung. The scene shifted to the palace, where King Leon Burke was roaring in anger over the news that 14 children of major noble families had been imprisoned. The king was furious because Adrian had used the gravest excuses, such as treason, to throw those individuals into prison. Adrian stood there with an impassive face, calmly listening to the old man's scolding, as if it had nothing to do with him. King Leon Burke admitted they deserved punishment, but touching 14 families at once would cause a terrible wave of opposition. He sighed in exasperation, scolding his accursed son for causing an earth-shattering incident right after his probation ended. Adrian smirked with calculation, asking the old man in return if he was afraid of the fierce reaction from the nobles. He calmly explained that those pampered young masters were essentially trash, outcasts even within their own families. Adrian made his decisive move with a radiant smile, yet full of the scent of gunpowder, sending a letter immediately. King Leon Burke asked blankly who it was for, while his accursed son spoke cryptically about those who could quell all the commotion. He flashed the smile of an old fox, revealing that the main targets were the siblings of the recently arrested, who were coveting their inheritance rights. The king was utterly speechless, realizing his son had just devised a scheme of indirect murder that was both insidious and effective. Subtly dismissed, Adrian gleefully departed with a triumphant expression, as the old man couldn't refute a single word of his sharp reasoning. Switching to benevolent mode, he radiated a shimmering aura to reassure the maid cowering in the corner of the room. Adelia Byron was so scared she was on the verge of tears, her voice trembling as she asked what she had done wrong to be called by her master by name. Seeing the girl trembling uncontrollably, Adrian broke into a cold sweat, realizing how terrifying his former reputation as trash had been to people. She came from a fallen noble family. The name Byron was so obscure that even direct descendants knew nothing of its past. But the truth was that this family's glorious and heroic history had been completely erased from the timeline by ancient wars. Their peerless sword techniques, once used to slay giants, were also lost to time, with no one remembering them anymore. Adrian narrowed his eyes sternly. He was the only one who could see through the remnants of great pride hidden within this small girl. Activating judgment, he scanned the dazzling golden status window, revealing Adelia's S-rank swordsmanship potential and a series of bizarre traits. Adrian flinched, his eyes wide as he skimmed through the bloody descriptions that starkly contrasted with her frail appearance. He couldn't believe his eyes at the absurdly contradictory combination of traits appearing right before him. On one side was the crazed, bloodthirsty butcher. On the other was the fragile heart that loved to care for others. Truly a powerful case of multiple personalities. Adrian tore at his hair, utterly bewildered, because this girl possessed innate talent but lacked control. If unleashed, she might well destroy the world. Adrian stood tall in the spacious room, cornering the small maid into a tense confrontation. He was sweating profusely, but his eyes were filled with determination, telling himself he had to take a risk to subdue this potential monster. Looking back at the dazzling golden status window with S-rank potential, he knew he couldn't miss out on such a strategic pawn. Adrian decided to strike at her fatal weakness, the slave mentality trait, which made its possessor find pleasure in serving a master. He called Adelia Byron by name and ordered her to swear loyalty to him immediately. The girl flinched, stammering in panic, unable to comprehend what was happening to her lowly status. Adrian gave her no retreat, forcing her to become a knight under his command right here and right now. Adelia turned pale with fear, collapsed to the floor, and hastily refused, thinking she wasn't worthy of such an honor. Adrian unleashed a powerful psychological attack, using her family as bait and promising to take responsibility for their protection. He sealed the deal, exchanging her family's safety for absolute obedience. Like a loyal dog, he asserted that if she couldn't control the madness in her blood, he would be the one to hold the reins and control it for her. Adelia tremblingly asked again to ensure her family would truly be saved, and Adrian nodded in confirmation. Her eyes lit up as if she'd struck gold, and she hastily nodded repeatedly, agreeing to devote her life to him in exchange for a chance to reunite with her family. Adelia Byron knelt, solemnly swearing absolute loyalty to Prince Adrian Leon Burke. She swore to consider him her sole master and serve him for life without hesitation. Adrian placed his hand on her head as if rewarding a pet. Uttering a satisfied compliment as his plan had succeeded, he stood up and ordered her to obey his commands unconditionally, and the girl bowed her head in docile reply. Adelia blushed deeply, her eyes revealing a strange excitement at being touched and commanded by him, perfectly matching the activated slave mentality trait. Seeing her excessively ecstatic expression, Adrian broke out in a cold sweat, wondering if he had just brought a huge problem upon himself. Rumors about the first prince acting like a thug, forcing knights to swear loyalty, were spreading everywhere, along with images of Arwen Kiergayan. People rumored that he not only beat up the noble scions half to death but also threw them into dungeons like criminals. The most outrageous rumor was that he appointed a frail maid who had never held a sword as his personal knight, which everyone suspected was a disguised harem. Adrian Leon Burke broke into a cold sweat, wondering since when this world had so much free time to scrutinize his private life so thoroughly. He sat blankly on the chair, bitterly realizing that he had only recruited one knight, yet bricks and stones were already flying at him from all directions. The king slammed the table and roared loudly, scolding him that while he was cleaning up the mess Adrian had caused, his damned son was chasing women again. The royal uncle looked at him with an utterly contemptuous gaze, uttering pathetic criticisms and asking if he intended to surrender the bet yet. The second prince appeared with his familiar sneer, sarcastically remarking that appointing a maid as a knight was truly his brother's cheap style. Adrian Leon Burke clutched his head in pain, wondering why bad news in this castle spread faster than a 5G network. Before he could even catch his breath, the maid announced the queen's arrival, leaving him only able to tilt his head back and scream in helplessness. The queen entered with an overwhelming aura, scolding him relentlessly, saying that she thought he had reformed, but he was just reverting to his old habits. She suddenly lowered her voice, full of calculation, muttering that this situation was actually surprisingly suitable for her plans. Adrian Leon Burke was utterly bewildered when his mother declared that if he just got married, he would immediately stop his frivolous ways. She declared, with fiery determination, to trust his mother, saying that this time she would definitely find him a reputable wife to keep him in check. After speaking, she turned abruptly and left without looking back, leaving her son sitting stunned on the chair, unable to utter a single word of protest. Adrian Leon Burke gave up completely. He was so speechless that he no longer knew how to react to this chaotic family. Getting back to the main point, Adelia Byrne looked at him with innocent eyes, timidly asking if she could receive mana. He stood up and affirmed confidently, promising to bestow upon her a special kind of power that ordinary people could only dream of. Adrian Leon Burke raised his hand to activate a skill. A powerful surge of blue mana erupted, preparing to awaken the girl's hidden potential. Though the world had forgotten the iron-blooded sword Marquis, he had not, and immediately summoned the soul of Agnes Byrne to possess Adelia Byrne amidst a brilliant golden aura. Adelia Byrne was immersed in the brilliant golden energy that enveloped her entire body and mind. A pure mana heart was gradually forming and beating with powerful, authoritative pulses right within the girl's chest. The system immediately displayed a notification, confirming that Adelia Byrne had officially sensed the flow of mana. Adrian Leon Burke broke into a cold sweat upon receiving the notification that the mana implantation process into the host body had been perfectly successful and stable. Adelia Byrne's eyes widened, glowing with a golden light as the mana heart completed and began pumping power throughout her body. The maid looked down at her glowing hands, trembling, unable to believe she possessed such luxurious power. Adrian Leon Burke stood up and explained that this was the method of forging a mana heart, and instructed her to diligently practice whenever she had free time. No sooner had he finished speaking than he staggered and collapsed onto the floor, causing Adelia Byrne to scream in extreme fear, calling out for His Highness. He propped himself up on his hands, panting, silently cursing his frail body for creating just one measly mana heart and already collapsing miserably. Adelia Byrne anxiously asked repeatedly why he had to sacrifice so much strength for someone as lowly and useless as her. Adrian Leon Burke waved it off, saying he was just a little tired, and coldly ordered her to leave immediately so he could rest. Seeing Adelia Byrne still standing there, staring at him blankly with a puzzled expression, he turned back and asked if she had any other issues. The girl suddenly bowed deeply, solemnly swearing to serve him devotedly with her entire life until her dying day to repay this kindness. Adrian Leon Burke smirked with calculation, reminding her never to forget the obvious truth that he was her master. Adelia Byrne clasped her hands together, her bright eyes shining, nodding vigorously in agreement with an extremely excited and reverent expression. He turned his back and walked away with a triumphant smile on his lips, muttering that he only feared she would forget her servant status. But right behind him, Adelia Byrne was staring intently with eyes glowing in the dark, exuding a terrifyingly possessive aura that sent shivers down one's spine. A few days later, the blonde guard came to report the latest situation regarding the old fox, Bernardo Eli, to Adrian Leon Burke. He stated that Bernardo Eli was being strictly held by the royal guards as a witness, and no one was allowed to meet him until the trial began. Upon hearing this, Adrian Leon Burke frowned unpleasantly, retorting, asking if a noble royal like him also had to drag himself to court. Adrian Leon Burke smiled triumphantly upon hearing the good news, his finger pointing skyward with a calculated and satisfied expression. He sat cross-legged, complaining about the troublesome trial, while Adelia Byrne diligently cleaned beside him. Adrian Leon Burke suddenly turned to inquire about the maid's situation, making her jump in surprise. He asked directly about the stability of her mana heart, and she immediately confirmed that everything was in order with a respectful attitude. Adrian Leon Burke stood up abruptly with sharp eyes, ordering her to join the training session starting today. He smirked confidently, giving her a thumbs-up gesture to go change, and then drag herself to the training ground immediately. Adrian Leon Burke leaned close to the blushing girl, reminding her to throw away the cleaning rag immediately because she was now a knight. At the training ground, Adrian Leon Burke was performing some warm-up stretches with an extremely relaxed demeanor. Carl approached with a grim, murderous expression, grumpily asking what in the world the prince was doing here. Adrian Leon Burke calmly replied that he was warming up, treating his opponent's scowling attitude as if it were thin air. He pointed into the distance, clarifying that the one who truly needed training was not him, but that girl. Adelia Bayern was gritting her teeth, running desperately in her training clothes, drenched in sweat as if she'd taken a bath, yet not daring to stop. Adrian Leon Burke calmly declared that he would turn this maid into a knight, disregarding all the rumors around them. Carl was furious, yelling and asking if the noble title of knight was just a cheap joke in his eyes. The two stood neck and neck, arguing fiercely in the training ground, and Adrian Leon Burke was not to be outdone, retorting that the other was a busybody. While Carl was still grumbling about his stubbornness, Adelia Bayern dragged herself to the spot, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She collapsed to the ground, panting as if on the verge of death after completing 10 hellish laps. Carl crossed his arms and turned away with extreme dissatisfaction, while Adrian Leon Burke merely silently looked down at the exhausted girl. Adelia Bayern hastily apologized for her weakness, but he brushed it aside and tossed her a wooden sword. Adrian Leon Burke swung his sword, creating a beautiful blue sword energy slash to demonstrate the basic cutting technique to her. Adelia Bayern took the wooden sword with a bewildered expression when he told her to try it once. She awkwardly took a defensive stance, her legs trembling as she unconfidently asked if her posture was correct. Suddenly, Adelia Bayern's green eyes flashed with a sharp, dangerous light as she activated her copying ability. Whoosh! She swung her sword, creating a perfect blue sword energy slash identical to the original, shaking the surrounding air. Carl froze completely, sweat pouring down his face as he witnessed the absurd sight right before his eyes. Even Adrian Leon Burke was utterly shocked, unable to believe she could copy that technique after just one glance. While Adelia Bayern innocently asked about her posture, he broke out in a cold sweat, realizing the serious problem this monster posed. He was startled to realize that if he was negligent for even a moment, she would surpass him in the blink of an eye with this insane growth rate. Her servitude trait made her obey the strong, not respect the weak, and memories of the fat prince from the past haunted him. Adrian Leon Burke shivered, imagining a scenario where Adelia Bayern grew stronger and turned her sword against his neck if he showed any weakness. Footsteps echoed, cutting through his panicked thoughts, and he turned his head with extreme vigilance. The royal uncle stepped forward, stroking his chin and praising the little girl's innate talent with eyes craving for talent. He stood towering behind him with an overwhelming aura, questioning what kind of monkey business he was up to here. Adrian Leon Burke roared in anger, warning the old man not to even think about coveting his subordinate. The royal uncle sneered contemptuously, retorting what qualifications someone like him had to teach that child. He drew his slender sword, scoffing that he was just a novice who had only held a sword for a few months, yet dared to claim to teach a genius. A surge of blue mana erupted around him, firmly asserting that he was not skilled enough to control this little monster. The light from the overwhelming power illuminated Adrian Leon Burke's downcast face, filled with calculation. If it were the trashy prince from the past, he would have trembled and tucked his tail, fleeing immediately before this aura. But his eyes blazed with killing intent, asserting that his current self was not that good for nothing, and was ready to face battle. A massive explosion of blue energy swept through the space, accompanied by an earth-shattering sound. Adrian Leon Burke appeared with icy eyes, arrogantly declaring that if he had stepped forward, no one had the right to interfere. Past life memories flooded back with images of the giant king, whose blood he had once used as a sacrifice in his glorious past. Next came the jaw full of sharp teeth of the mad dragon, and countless other mighty creatures he had once slaughtered. All those bloody achievements were tied to the name of the legendary demonic sword, Gruhorn. The system announced that a part of a soul was manifesting according to the user's will, while his eyes glowed blood red. Adrian Leon Burke's face hardened with killing intent, as a crimson mana surge began to swallow the blue light. The royal uncle began to sweat profusely, his eyes wavering intensely as he felt the terrifying pressure from his nephew. He stood amidst a sea of blazing red mana, growling, asserting that the girl belonged to him. His eyes rolled wildly like a demon's, and he let out a possessive roar to assert absolute ownership. He warned the old man before him not to gaze upon or covet anything that belonged to him. Killing intent erupted fiercely as he admitted he utterly detested anyone who dared to steal his possessions. The royal uncle stood, rooted to the spot in shock, while Adelia behind him also trembled, clutching the wooden stick tightly. A close-up showed Adrian Leon Burke's pupils contracting into a vertical, crimson slit, like a reptile's eye. Suddenly, his mind was dragged into an undefined space, accompanied by heavy gasping sounds. He floated amidst murky black water, feeling reality slowly dissolving and losing his sense of life. The surrounding space was left with only coldness and darkness enveloping his gradually sinking body. His face began to crack like porcelain, wondering if this was an omen for the collapse of his frail body. In his consciousness, his small body floated before a colossal sword, about to be devoured by Gruhorn's spirit. Tens of thousands of crimson arms grabbed him, intending to tear him apart, when a sudden blue light cut across, accompanied by a command to stop. Adrian swung his hand, condensing a brilliant stream of blue mana, preparing to unleash a power-displaying technique. He stood tall in the middle of the training ground with a mana sword in his hand as his uncle approached. Adrian tilted his head with a bored expression, listening to the moral lecture about the value of a knight. His uncle vehemently asserted that an outstanding knight could take on 100 ordinary soldiers to defend his point. He pointed towards Adelia, firmly believing that this girl had the potential to save thousands of lives in the future. Adrian stroked his chin and thought, wondering if it was an unshakable belief or merely the delusion of an old man. The image of the illustrious northern commander appeared in his memory, holding noble ideals of great righteousness. Adrian picked his ear and replied curtly, "I couldn't care less," completely freezing his uncle. His uncle tried to salvage the situation with arguments about saving humanity, but Adrian coldly called him by his title, Count, to shut him up. Adelia unexpectedly spoke up, placing her hand on her chest and asserting that both her body and heart belonged to His Highness. Adelia's concluding remark, "I cannot obey you," completely shocked his uncle, causing him to break out in a cold sweat. Adrian smirked triumphantly, knowing that her servitude trait made her absolutely obedient to anyone of higher rank. He crossed his arms and subtly dismissed his uncle, reminding him that his initial goal was merely to help him lose weight. Adrian issued an ultimatum, forbidding his uncle from interfering in his private affairs if he still wanted to show his face in this palace. His uncle gritted his teeth bitterly but had to swallow his anger and nod in agreement under the pressure from his nephew. Despite being forbidden, he still shamelessly came to the training ground every day, just to stand afar and watch Adelia swing her sword. Adrian observed and smirked, considering the proud uncle's restless, worm-like fidgeting as entertainment. Adelia swung her wooden sword, unexpectedly creating a brilliant golden aura surrounding the blade. His uncle's eyes widened in extreme horror as he realized a peak-level technique had just appeared. Even Adrian was startled, not expecting the girl to have learned sword resonance at such an unbelievable speed. Adrian clapped enthusiastically, continuously praising Adelia, saying, "Well done," which made the girl blush deeply out of shyness. Adelia smiled happily, her eyes crinkling, while Adrian secretly broke out in a cold sweat, because the girl's miraculous progress might soon surpass even his own. His uncle, with a grim face, rushed over, interrupting the atmosphere, glaring and questioning Adrian if he had also taught the girl the mana heart. Adrian nonchalantly admitted it, causing the Count to grit his teeth, his veins bulging on his face from anger. He turned to scold Adelia, calling her foolish for learning such a cheap trick instead of following the orthodox path. Adrian's eyes immediately darkened, and a chilling killing intent began to emanate upon seeing his favorite student being humiliated. He coldly ordered his uncle to be immediately kicked out of the training ground, showing no regard for their familial ties. His uncle cried out regretfully, claiming Adrian had completely destroyed the boundless potential of a genius with trivial, trashy tricks. Adrian didn't bother to argue or explain, turning to order Carl to decisively escort the guest out. The Count haughtily lifted his chin, brushing aside Carl's offer, and declared he would leave on his own 2 feet. His uncle's resentful figure gradually disappeared into the twilight, leaving behind a suffocating silence on the training ground. Adelia anxiously asked Adrian if the power she had just learned was truly worthless as rumored. Adrian immediately denied it with an extremely serious expression, reassuring the girl's wavering spirit. The girl still wondered why someone of the Count's status and profound knowledge would assert something so definitively. Adrian smirked and explained that it was simply because the old man knew nothing about the true nature of power. He looked towards the sunset, lamenting that the people of this era had completely forgotten how truly formidable the Mana Heart's true form was. Adrian was frustrated because they had discarded that precious legacy, like a pair of old, worn-out shoes, simply due to their own ignorance. He turned back to look at Adelia with resolute eyes, asserting that she would soon witness its true power. A sudden crackle of blue electricity erupted around the wooden sword stuck in the ground, signaling that a showdown was about to begin. Adrian stood with crossed arms, scoffing at his uncle's slyness, seeing that the old man, who had just left, had returned with his sword, demanding Adrian prove his words. The royal uncle proudly declared that he would give Adrian a handicap by only using a single mana chain. Adrian gripped the hilt of the wooden sword tightly, coldly reminding him of their old bet from years ago to see if he still remembered. He stood tall in the middle of the training ground, smirking as he asked again if he dared to grant the winner's wish. The royal uncle activated blue mana around his sword, boldly promising to give anything, even his family's secret technique, if Adrian won. Adrian took his stance with a blue flame flaring from his left chest, smirking as he said he didn't care for that trashy secret technique. The battle erupted immediately, as both charged at each other with surging, killing intent. The royal uncle immediately realized his nephew's malicious intent when he saw Adrian aiming straight for his throat with the very first move. Adrian dodged and weaved with extreme agility, while the old man smirked and praised that Adrian's swordplay was still as treacherous as ever. He leaned back by a hair's breadth to avoid the wooden blade slashing down with wind-rending force. Adrian's eyes were sharp, his pupils constricted in intense focus, searching for his opponent's fatal opening. Both charged at each other, exchanging furious blows as their wooden swords clashed, creating shockwaves that kicked up dust. A sword strike thrust straight upwards with terrifying speed, tearing through the air. Adrian gritted his teeth and parried the blow, the impact so strong it created illusions around them as the two swords collided. The royal uncle leaned in close to his face, a disdainful smile playing on his lips, and asked if his nephew's capabilities were limited to just this. Adrian broke out in a cold sweat, his hands trembling uncontrollably as the old man's overwhelming power mercilessly suppressed him. He was flung far back, sliding across the ground with dust flying everywhere, but his hand still gripped his sword tightly. The old man stood tall, looking down with an air of superiority, and coldly asked if Adrian was ready to give up. Adrian propped himself up with his sword and stood, a defiant smile on his face, asserting that he was far from surrendering to the old man. He admitted that the royal uncle was too strong, and that the old man was waiting for him to unleash all his mana to crush him even more miserably. Adrian knew well that with his current low-level mana heart, his utter defeat was already predetermined. Adrian gave a meaningful smirk and asked his opponent in return if he found this situation strange. The royal uncle frowned in confusion as his nephew suddenly brought up historical context from 400 years ago. He recalled the golden age when countless knights using mana hearts achieved incredible feats like slaying dragons or cutting down monsters. However, Ernest Altringen appeared with a new, more convenient technique, causing all the great legacies of their ancestors to suddenly be regarded as trash. The ignorant masses assumed that mana chains were a superior and far more powerful method of energy manipulation than the classic mana heart. The royal uncle lost his patience, pressing to know what his nephew was rambling about in the middle of this intense battle. Adrian gripped the wooden sword tightly in his hand, his gaze firm, asserting that his thoughts were completely different from the masses. He declared boldly that while they were all mana hearts, not all of them were equally useless. Adrian looked directly into his opponent's eyes and unexpectedly asked if the old man had ever heard of the battle spirit hymn. The royal uncle swung his sword, cutting through the air with a tearing sound, dismissing the nonsense, and reminding him that this was an arena, not a classroom. Adrian chuckled with amusement because the old man's disdainful reaction was entirely within his expectations. He began to channel mana, sarcastically remarking on how the uncle always disparaged mana hearts as merely crude techniques used by low-level mercenaries. Adrian's eyes glowed bright blue. He coldly refused any break and declared he was ready to turn the tables immediately. He stomped his foot hard on the ground, activating a surging blue mana current from below, with the philosophy that the path a knight walks is their achievement. Adrian held his sword before his chest, declaring that his past 100 victories were his pride and source of strength. The royal uncle broke out in a cold sweat, stunned to see the system announce a hymn celebrating victories against 20 trainees. Images of Adrian utterly dominating the new recruits appeared vividly within the mana flow, engraving those achievements directly into his heart. Every sword stroke, every small victory over the past half-year, was condensed to forge the battle spirit hymn skill. A brilliant blue mana flow enveloped Adrian, officially activating the normal grade battle spirit hymn skill, named Hymn of Training Battles. Adrian gave a domineering smile within the brilliant aura, asserting that these small achievements had forged the true power of the mana heart. The royal uncle coldly asserted that as long as Adrian used a mana heart, he was no match for the uncle's domineering mana chains. Adrian charged forward like a wind-piercing arrow, his eyes blazing with determination to fight his opponent to the death. The two wooden swords clashed, creating a loud explosion. Adrian attacked with all his might but was blocked. The uncle explained that the energy from mana chains had a backflow characteristic, completely suppressing the mana heart. Adrian gritted his teeth, enduring, sweat pouring down as the blue pressure tried to choke him. The uncle sneered arrogantly, confident that his nephew would soon have to kneel and beg for mercy. He pushed Adrian back while offering a somewhat sarcastic compliment about his nephew's stubborn resilience. Adrian unexpectedly gave a defiant smile amidst the surrounding pressure, his eyes flashing with a hint of turning the tables. Memories of over 100 training battles and thousands of blows endured from the trainees surged back like a torrent of power. Adrian screamed in his mind, asserting that he had forged himself through thousands of fierce waves to reach this day. A colossal pillar of blue light shot straight into the sky, dispelling all surrounding pressure and making Adrian's blonde hair wildly flutter. Adrian's entire body was enveloped by brilliant blue mana flames, officially activating the domineering power of the Hymn of Training Battles. A sword strike, carrying a blue streak, tore through the air, hurtling straight towards his opponent with terrifying speed. Adrian pointed his sword directly at the uncle's face, defiantly declaring that this wager was now truly worth him unleashing his full power. He stomped his foot on the ground, creating an explosion of dust, and lunged forward like a beast unleashed. A sharp, clanging sound echoed as Adrian swung his sword with a powerful slash, forcing the uncle to raise his weapon in astonishment to block. Adrian continuously unleashed tempestuous sword strikes, forcing the uncle into a desperate defense against his new power. Adrian's eyes were as sharp as knives, pouring all his focus and strength into each destructive slash. The royal uncle began to break out in a cold sweat, his face changing color as he realized his nephew was not as easy to deal with as he had thought. A heavy clang echoed. The uncle had to brace himself to block the powerful attack from Adrian's wooden sword. Adrian Leon Burke took a stance with his wooden sword enveloped in blue mana, his surging aura overwhelming his stunned uncle standing opposite him. He smirked arrogantly, his eyes full of provocation, as if to say the game had only truly begun. Adrian spoke sarcastically. "How about that? Didn't I tell you?" Leaving his uncle dumbfounded in the training ground. The royal uncle retorted defiantly, lightning mana surging around him. "Not all mana hearts are the same. You're far too arrogant, kid." A loud thud echoed as his uncle's heel crushed the ground, gathering momentum for a deadly lunge. His uncle's sword slashed down like divine lightning, tearing through the air to form a massive blue streak of light aimed directly at Adrian's head. Boom! The shocking explosion sent dust flying everywhere. Adrian gritted his teeth to block the attack, but the immense weight forced a pained grunt from him. His uncle emerged from the smoke with a condescending expression, declaring he would stop playing around and praising his nephew for holding out until now. Adrian knelt on the ground, but instead of fear, he calmly analyzed that this ordinary grade war soul hymn skill was truly trash. He propped his sword on the ground, beginning to mutter about the story from 400 years ago, while his uncle stood tall before him. Adrian's sharp eyes looked up, firmly asserting that the senior knights had made a fatal mistake. In a glorious memory, the ancestor Leon Burke stood proudly upon a mountain of Orc Legion corpses, proving that they had wiped out the enemies so thoroughly that nothing was left for future generations. Initially, all the finest elements, from swordsmanship and the method of cultivating the mana heart to the brilliant war soul hymn, were passed down intact. But time, like termites, gradually gnawed away at those glorious achievements, causing later generations of knights to gradually fall into the abyss of oblivion. Stories of unseen dragons and unheard-of giant kings gradually became distant memories. They were considered by people to be absurd, ridiculous legends, just like this image of a fat dragon lying belly up. Of course, new war soul hymns were still created, but they were just trash used to defeat a few dozen soldiers or 10 minor knights. Those low-grade skills could not reach the mythical or heroic thresholds, and were eventually swept away by the wind due to their utter weakness. Adrian returned to reality, looking his uncle straight in the face, and judging that cheap mana chain thing could never reach transcendence. The royal uncle was utterly bewildered, questioning back if his nephew was drunk in broad daylight to be babbling such nonsense all this time. Vale Balorhard appeared with a cold expression, enveloped in a blue aura, ready to teach his arrogant nephew a lesson he would never forget. Adrian stomped his foot on the ground, red mana flared up like hellfire, and he directly cursed the knights as arrogant fools. He stood amidst a storm of black and red energy, declaring he would open a remedial class on true power for these narrow-minded fools. Adrian gripped his wooden sword tightly, dense red mana surging around his arm like the surging blood vessels of a dragon. The silhouette of a colossal black dragon appeared behind him, exuding an overwhelming killing intent that rendered all ordinary treasured swords meaningless. Adrian's eyes were sharp as razors. He growled every word about tearing off dragon scales and drinking its hot blood like a predator. He activated the ultimate skill, War Soul Hymn, True Dragon's World Annihilation, his entire body glowing fiery red like a god of war. His frail body immediately protested, the system issuing continuous red alerts, unable to withstand the terrifying load of this heavy-grade skill. A series of error messages appeared. The system was forced to cut down segments of the hymn to save its master's life before he self-destructed. Adrian accepted the heavily scaled-down version, unleashing only 1/4 of its power with the dragon scale severing technique. He swung his sword, his fiery red eye flashing in the darkness, unleashing a destructive sword strike that tore through the wind. Vale charged forward with blue lightning, but Adrian did not flinch, charging straight into a direct confrontation, fighting his uncle to the death. The wooden sword enveloped in red mana powerfully clashed with the blue energy stream, creating electric sparks that tore through the surrounding space. Vale's eyes widened in horror, realizing that if he didn't go all out, he would be immediately devoured by this monster. His uncle's 4 mana circles spun wildly, forced to unleash all his defensive power to withstand this insane attack. A thunderous explosion, like a bomb blast, echoed, and thick smoke and dust rose, obscuring the entire training ground, making the spectators' hearts skip a beat. Adrian was thrown far back by the recoil, rolling on the ground while the guards screamed in alarm, thinking the prince had been annihilated. As the dust gradually cleared, Adrian slowly got back up. Though battered, his aura still soared to the sky, his feet standing firm on the cracked ground. He sat down on the ground, smirking contemptuously, then asked mockingly, "Didn't you say you'd only use 1 circle?" Vale broke out in a cold sweat, utterly humiliated, realizing he had broken his promise and had to use all 4 mana circles just to save his old life from his nephew. Vale stood dazed, looking at the broken wooden sword, bitterly admitting he had failed to protect his weapon from his nephew's strike. Adrian slowly got up from the rubble, his body trembling and battered after the extremely powerful collision. The old uncle still tried to salvage some dignity, beginning to lecture that mana from the heart was inferior compared to mana from the rings. Adrian showed no respect, interrupting and calling out his uncle's full name and title with an extremely sharp attitude. Vale broke out in a cold sweat, speechless upon hearing his nephew bluntly declare that he had won. The memory of the black dragon monster pierced by a sword reappeared, screaming in Adrian's mind to stop. Adrian's eyes widened in horror, sweat pouring down him like rain, begging that source of power to stop tormenting his body. A sudden heart attack struck him, making him clutch his chest, feeling as if his heart was about to explode from overload. He collapsed onto the bed in his bedroom, completely shut down and fell into a coma after the exhausting battle. His hand clutched the bedsheet tightly, his body twitching slightly in a painful stupor. Adrian woke up, his face contorted, silently cursing the damned hymn of the king's skill that had utterly exhausted him. This was the steep price for forcibly activating the power of the dragon scale slash when his body was not yet ready. He recalled the moment he unleashed the move, realizing this skill emulated a truly powerful dragon-slaying legend. Even with his body battered, Adrian smirked triumphantly, asserting that this risk was entirely worth the achieved results. He began circulating blue mana, proud of the first hymn of the king he had woven himself. The image of a warrior spirit appeared, a testament to the unyielding will that had overcome hundreds of battles and 1,000 raging waves. The system announced that the level of the combat hymn of the king had slightly increased, making him extremely satisfied. Adrian adjusted his collar, confident that this power was enough to humble the wretched third prince, just as the maid entered. The maid dropped her tray, bursting into tears of relief upon seeing her master finally awaken from his stupor. Still crying, she recounted how the queen had flown into a rage and thoroughly scolded Uncle Vale after Adrian had fainted. Adrian chuckled gleefully in chibi form upon hearing his uncle was scolded, saying the old man deserved it. He instructed the maid to report immediately once the count awoke, so he could settle the score. Adrian suddenly changed his mind and collapsed onto the bed, telling Adelia not to report yet as he needed a little more rest. A sharp, intense pain flared from his old wound, making him break out in a cold sweat. He told himself that if he didn't properly recover mentally after overusing the hymn of the king, the price would be extremely steep. Reality and past memories would blend into a chaotic mess, causing the boundary between real and illusion to completely collapse. Adrian shivered, a chill running down his spine at the thought of being trapped in the demonic sword's memories again, after struggling so hard to become human. The image of Agnes Byrne appeared, majestic and formidable. A great female swordswoman, surrounded by a fiery aura. Adrian, while devouring his food, declared that since Adelia was her descendant, she would surely inherit that formidable skill. Adelia was astonished to learn her ancestor was such a powerhouse, while Adrian nonchalantly stuffed his mouth with food. He sternly reminded her that she needed to become much stronger to be capable enough to bear the power of that epic hymn. Adrian looked directly into the girl's eyes and posed a critical question. "What the hell do you want to learn swordsmanship for?" Adelia was flustered, stammering, unsure how to answer in the face of her master's overwhelming presence. She lowered her gaze in thought, pondering her true desire if she were to become a knight. Adrian looked impatient, about to leave, while Adelia was still blushing furiously, struggling to utter each word. He callously turned his back and walked away, telling her to speak later if she hadn't figured it out yet. A sudden surge of presence emanated from Adelia's feet as she spoke, stopping him. Adrian paused, turning his head to look at the maid with a mix of curiosity and surprise. Adelia clenched her fists, her eyes burning as she declared firmly, "I will become your sword." Adrian stared wide-eyed, completely surprised that this timid girl dared to make such a bold statement. The sound of war horns echoed, accompanied by the image of a mighty legion, signaling a legend about to begin from a fervent oath. Adrian froze for a few seconds, completely unexpected that this girl would go so far as to dedicate her very soul. Adelia knelt, pouring her heart into an oath of lifelong loyalty to her master amidst a brilliant aura. The system promptly announced that Adelia had activated the Hymn of Submission, making Adrian stare in astonishment at its overwhelming power. A warm current of energy from the oath began to seep into Adrian's every cell, directly connecting with his soul. A golden tree of light erupted from Adelia, proving this skill to be an extremely rare masterpiece. Adrian exclaimed with delight as the system confirmed the successful creation of the common-grade Hymn of Submission skill. This was not merely a combat skill, but a soul contract, transforming anyone with the servitude trait into an absolutely loyal vassal. Adelia blushed as she called her master, while Adrian secretly appreciated that the descendant of the Sword Marquis could create such a splendid skill. Adrian clenched his fist, feeling the new power surging, admitting he had just stumbled upon an unexpected windfall. He smirked victoriously, determining that as long as he lived, Adelia's development would be a goldmine for him to exploit. Adelia smiled innocently and happily, completely unaware that she had just officially become her master's leveling tool. Adrian stood up and thanked her, making the maid flinch, unaccustomed to being treated kindly like a human. She looked at Adrian with glistening eyes, her cheeks flushed, on the verge of tears from emotion. Adrian sat back on the bed, his mind still calculating how best to guide the girl's development. A few days later, the magnificent castle appeared under a clear blue sky, signaling a day full of storms. Adrian had changed into a luxurious royal outfit, but his face was beaded with sweat, full of tension, as he sat in the hot seat. The blonde guard and Adelia stood behind him, their faces worried, seeing their master under pressure from his superiors. A concerned voice inquired about his health, making Adrian stammer that he was fine, though his heart was screaming. He cast a weary glance, thinking to himself that dealing with these people concerned about his corpse was even tougher than fighting enemies. The queen looked down with a sorrowful expression, feeling awkward as she mentioned the former owner of this body. She hesitantly asked Adrian if he still resented his uncle for the near-fatal beating. Despite his mother pleading with clasped hands to let everything go, Adrian coldly replied that he didn't mind it at all. The queen burst into uncontrollable sobs, unable to believe him, thinking he was lying to hide the pain of being tormented by his uncle. Adrian scratched his cheek helplessly, beads of sweat forming as he had no idea how to deal with this tearful display. In his mind, he recalled the moment he delivered the decisive blow, completely shattering his uncle's pride and conviction. He had planted a heart demon in the defeated man's mind, forcing him to live in torment and fear. Adrian sat on the chair with an indifferent expression, thinking that if his uncle couldn't overcome that shock, he was nothing but a good-for-nothing. The queen wiped her tears and smiled, revealing that his uncle was actually very proud of his remarkable progress. That stern-faced uncle had humbled himself to beg the king to lift Adrian's house arrest earlier than expected. Cold sweat broke out on Adrian's forehead, his face showing a hint of confusion upon realizing he owed an unexpected favor. It turned out that as soon as he was released, he went and caused trouble, putting his uncle in an extremely awkward position in front of everyone. He stroked his chin thoughtfully, only now understanding why his uncle had such a disappointed and harsh attitude when they met again. Adrian clasped his hands together, full of doubt, wondering why such a powerful person would bother with his affairs. The atmosphere grew heavy, as an old white-bearded man named Niccolo Marciadel appeared with a radiant smile and a stack of books in his hands. Adrian's face darkened. He immediately and sharply refused this absurd request for studies. The blonde guard and Adelia stood tucked away behind him, exchanging uneasy glances at their master's difficult situation. Adrian rolled on the floor, screaming in protest against studying, while the old man calmly lectured on the difference between humans and beasts. He sprang up, snapping angrily at being compared to an animal, but the old scholar merely sneered, teasing that he wasn't even skilled enough to be called a beast. Adrian sat slumped on the floor with a scowling face, asserting that he was already dominant enough and didn't need to cram any more knowledge. The old scholar stroked his beard and sneered, accepting the arrogant challenge of the stubborn prince. He placed the stack of books on the table, laying down a stern condition. If Adrian won the debate, he would leave immediately. Adrian smirked confidently, his eyes sharp as if he had already secured victory in this tempting wager. He slammed his hand on the table with a thud, fully agreeing with the sharp point just made in the debate. Adrian passionately expounded on human nature, asserting that anyone too kind would immediately be trampled upon by others. Seeing that the fish had taken the bait, the old man gently pushed the book, Theory of the Iron-Blooded Monarch, towards him with a meaningful gaze. Adrian picked up the book and devoured it, deeply appreciating the theory that viewed the relationship between ruler and subject as merely a fair exchange of benefits. He nodded, admitting the old man had a point, for all relationships in life were, after all, a give-and-take game. The debate lasted from noon until dusk, both engrossed in discussing politics, forgetting time and space. The old scholar closed the book, ending the highly effective discussion with an extremely satisfied expression. In the conciliatory atmosphere, the old man scheduled a continuation for tomorrow, and Adrian happily accepted without any caution. He clapped his hands and laughed heartily, feeling refreshed as it had been a long time since he found someone on the same wavelength to discuss thorny topics. Suddenly, Adrian froze, his face blank like a stunned goose, realizing he had just obediently sat through a proper lesson. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, his smile vanishing as he realized he had been spectacularly led by the nose by that cunning old man. The old scholar walked out of the room, secretly praising the sharp intellect of this infamous yet extremely cunning prince. He walked between two rows of guards, pondering that Adrian was completely different from the trashy rumors outside. The bright blue sky heralded the start of a new day in this kingdom, rife with schemes. Adrian lay upside down on his bed, his face showing utter boredom, not knowing what to do to kill time after days of frantic training. He sighed deeply to the blonde guard, complaining that he was so bored he felt like he was growing mold. While tossing and turning on the bed from sheer idleness, a knock on the door sounded, announcing that his uncle Vale Balorhard had come to visit, making him spring up. Adrian gestured to the maid to immediately invite the waiting guest inside. He stood with hands on hips, full of confidence, muttering that it was about time his uncle visited after a few days of silence. However, cold sweat began to break out on his forehead as he realized something was off about the atmosphere, his smile fading. Vale Balorhard entered with a murderous expression, making Adrian flinch, thinking his uncle was still holding a grudge over the heart demon incident. The renowned count silently bowed his head, his face as sorrowful as if he had suffered a great loss, causing the atmosphere to grow heavy. Adrian's eyes widened in surprise, dumbfounded, when his uncle unexpectedly apologized instead of rushing to beat him. Vale Balorhard stood solemnly, admitting fault for breaking his promise and severely injuring his nephew, without offering a single excuse. Adrian broke out in a cold sweat, his conscience gnawing at him, because he was bedridden due to overusing his dragon-slaying skill, not because his uncle had struck him. He recalled the sight of his queen mother worrying to the point of tears, feeling a piling guilt for letting his uncle bear this unwarranted responsibility. His uncle sternly offered Adrian to make any request he wished as compensation for the mistake. Vale Balorhard declared his readiness to offer a hand or an eye if needed, making Adrian shudder and immediately refuse that horrifying pile of waste. He crossed his arms in exasperation, secretly thinking that his uncle was truly too serious and rigid. No wonder he was always stuck in his own shadow. Adrian burst out laughing, deciding to act magnanimous to ease this tense, blood-soaked atmosphere. He changed his attitude, seriously declaring that he would state his true desire first. Adrian stood facing his uncle, loudly demanding permission to go on a proper excursion. Vale Balorhard frowned in confusion, wondering why his nephew still needed to ask so formally even after his house arrest was over. Adrian raised a finger to explain that he wanted to go on a really long trip, to leave this cramped capital, not just stroll around the garden. He talked endlessly about his plans, while his uncle maintained a pensive expression, considering safety. Adrian smirked cunningly, knowing full well that arranging the itinerary to avoid the upcoming banquet would take some time, but he didn't mind waiting at all. Vale Balorhard nodded in agreement, saying he would contact him after arrangements were made, while Adrian successfully sealed the deal with an extremely smug expression. Adrian stood with hands on hips, full of authority, beside the blonde guard. The silence was so profound you could hear a fly buzz. He turned to glare at the sweating guard, directly asking what his subordinate was staring at so intently. The guard scratched his head and gave an awkward laugh, confessing that he thought Adrian would demand something outrageous. Adrian lowered his face, acting dramatically, his voice deepening as he reminded him that his uncle had broken a promise, making this a once-in-a-millennium opportunity. He glanced and sighed, feigning nobility by saying that seeing that stubborn old man suffer like that made him feel a little sympathetic. The guard laughed loudly, which annoyed Adrian, who then directly yelled at his subordinate, saying he seemed to be getting too familiar with his master lately. A voice rang out, interrupting the lecture, and Adrian, startled, turned around with a bewildered expression. The maid appeared with a bright smile, offering with both hands the letter Adrian had been eagerly awaiting. Adrian's hands quickly broke the red wax seal, preparing to check the important message that had just arrived. The letter's content appeared along with an image of Arwen Kurgayan, exploding with aura and surging blue mana. Arwen Kurgayan, in blue armor and holding a sword, stood proudly, announcing that she was coming to visit him. Adrian held the letter with a smug smile. Truly, good news arrived exactly when he needed it most. 5 days after the good news, the grand royal carriage procession officially rolled out of the city gates. Adrian excitedly poked his head out of the carriage like a child, shouting and asking where their destination was. After all, Carl rode his horse closer, his face wrinkled like a monkey eating chili, grumbling because the prince couldn't sit still. Carl directly pushed Adrian's head back into the carriage, concluding that he would explain later, so be quiet. The emblem of the Ellen territory appeared powerfully, featuring an eagle and crossed swords. This was a bustling mineral mine, where miners were strenuously extracting high-quality iron ore. Images of muscular blacksmiths heating metal to a red glow, forging the sharpest weapons. Adrian clenched his fists, extremely excited because he hit the jackpot, while Carl looked at him with eyes full of concern. Chibi Adrian sweated profusely as he thought about several assassination attempts, next to an illustration of a dummy stabbed with its guts spilling out. He sat in the carriage with a sneer, calculating that to get good stuff, he had to drag himself out of the royal palace. Adrian glanced with calculating eyes, his face sharp and cold, preparing for the upcoming plundering plans. Carl rode his horse outside, his scarred face stern. Yet he was deep in thought about something. As the procession crossed the plains, Carl yelled at Adrian to close the window, making him vehemently protest like a leech touching lime. The journey map appeared. The first destination was the Ellen territory. Then they would visit the Iron Lion Castle. The grand escort cavalry advanced, expected to rest and recuperate before returning to the capital. Adrian sat with crossed arms in the carriage, looking utterly dejected from having to sit still for 3 whole days. He dejectedly looked at Adelia, who was sitting still like a statue in the opposite seat, offering no amusement to relieve his boredom. Adrian sighed deeply and lengthily. So bored he was almost growing moss in this luxurious mobile box. His eyes suddenly gleamed. Taking advantage of his free time, he decided to check his empty mana heart. He took a deep breath, clearly feeling the side effect of using the Dragon Slayer heart, which was the complete depletion of his energy reserves. In his mind's eye, Adrian meditated in the void, beginning the process of recharging his energy reserves. He felt every vibration of the carriage, the cold wind sweeping past, and the chatter of the knights outside. Adrian focused intensely, gathering every floating mana particle in space to fill the void in his heart. Suddenly, the mana surged abnormally, making him startle and utter a sound of surprise. The mana mass in his mind's eye exploded, swelling to a colossal size beyond his imagination. The system announced that he had reached his limit and had seen a fragment of a great will thanks to his previous reckless act. Adrian clutched his chest in pain as the surge of power backfired, his mana heart violently forced to expand. His body completely transformed to contain the new power, officially stepping into the realm of a sword expert. The system announced that the sealing chains had shattered, and the connection to the source of power was spectacularly restored. Adrian snapped his eyes open, his gaze sharp as his clairvoyance and clairaudience senses had just been powerfully upgraded. Adelia timidly called out. Seeing the prince emerge from his meditative state with an unusual aura, he clenched his fists in excitement, smiling triumphantly as he had just taken a long stride on his path to supremacy. The carriage stopped before the grand and luxurious mansion of the Ellen family under the blazing sunlight. Adrian stepped out of the carriage with a cold expression, glancing at the estate of the local nobles, while Carl stood guard. Edgar and his son Torrance bowed deeply, respectfully welcoming the prince who was visiting their territory. Old Edgar eagerly invited him, intending to lead Adrian to his resting chambers immediately after the long journey. Adrian ignored the invitation, scanning the corridor filled with the lords' displayed weapons with a scrutinizing gaze. This mansion was stuffed with gleaming swords and blades, truly a place for weapon production, but on closer inspection, it was merely gaudy. In Adrian's eyes, this pile of flashy decorations was just worthless junk, completely useless in real combat. He walked decisively down the corridor, ignoring the retinue and the host who were trailing behind him. Adrian frowned in disappointment, realizing it would be quite difficult to find anything worthwhile in this flashy junk heap. He turned and directly asked old Edgar about the location of the blacksmith's guild in this territory, which left the old man dumbfounded. Adrian demanded to go there and inspect it immediately, making Edgar break out in a cold sweat because the esteemed guest refused to rest. The group changed direction, their footsteps echoing steadily on the stone floor leading to the workshop area behind. Edgar walked along, cautiously explaining that the blacksmiths here were ill-tempered and stubborn as stone. He feared Adrian would be displeased because the smiths would only bury their faces in iron and steel, completely ignoring even the lord while working. Adrian's eyes lit up with interest, ignoring the old man's empty warnings about their rudeness. The doors swung open. A wave of stifling heat hit their faces, and the deafening clang of hammers echoed throughout the fiery forge. Edgar Allan broke out in a cold sweat, timidly calling Adrian as he silently advanced into this hot and grimy area. Adrian walked straight into the scorching forge, ignoring the deafening clang of hammers and the roaring flames around him, as if they wanted to devour everything. The heat blasted his face, making Adrian sweat profusely, but his eyes lit up with intense interest as he sensed something different. The hammer strikes on the anvil rang out with a metallic crispness, each beat steady, decisive, and containing remarkable technical power. Among the ordinary blacksmiths, Adrian stopped abruptly behind a muscular old man who was diligently swinging his hammer as if the entire world around him didn't exist. The old blacksmith, with his white hair, was highly focused, every bulging muscle moving rhythmically with each fiery hammer strike. Adrian's pupils contracted sharply. He recognized this clear sound, a forging technique so familiar it was haunting. In his mind, the image of the radiant holy sword Gruhorn immediately appeared, the first and most primal memory he had ever recalled from his previous life. Lost in his recollections, Adrian was startled when he felt someone gently wiping the sweat from his cheek. Adelia Byrne gently used a handkerchief to wipe her master's face, her voice full of worry as she saw him standing there dazed and sweating profusely. Adrian let out a soft sound of surprise, then allowed the maid to naturally tend to him. He glanced around with a sharp gaze, quickly regained his focus, and assessed the actual situation in the forge. The entire forge fell silent. The smith stopped working and stood at attention. Only the old man's hammer continued to clang defiantly. The blacksmiths unanimously placed their hands on their chests and bowed respectfully in greeting to Adrian, led by the mustachioed foreman. Edgar Allan hastily introduced the foreman, Zaxxon, the head of the blacksmith's guild here, with a face full of feigned pride. The old man's ill-timed hammer strikes continued to interrupt the polite greetings, making the atmosphere awkward and tense. Zaxxon flew into a rage, spun around, and loudly yelled at the old man who was working, for his lack of etiquette in front of the esteemed guest. The foreman roughly covered the old man's mouth. This noisy and rude action made Adrian openly frown in displeasure at being disturbed. Adrian coldly observed the poor old man bowing his head in resignation, a look of resignation and weariness clearly visible on his haggard face. The half-forged sword lay forlornly on the anvil, gradually cooling and unfinished, like the suppressed fate of the old smith himself. Adrian glanced, assessing the situation and knowing full well that these smiths were being forced to work like slaves rather than willingly. He coldly warned the smiths that if they continued to stand idly by and let the forge fire die out, they should prepare to be wiped out. The foreman Zaxxon was scared out of his wits, shouting, and urging the lackeys to grab the tongs and pump the bellows immediately. Adrian stood with his arms crossed, watching the disorganized group scurrying about with a sharp gaze full of overwhelming authority. The prince stood silent as a statue, focused on observing every movement in the forge, which was blazing with heat. The old blacksmith still calmly swung his hammer, sweating profusely, but his eyes were intensely focused on the glowing red iron bar. The hammer struck the anvil with sharp clangs. Sparks flew everywhere, creating a symphony of metal and heat. Adrian was completely captivated by the old man's thin yet resilient back amidst the blazing sea of fire. Adrian's pupils contracted, reflecting the blazing flames as if he had just found something kindred in spirit. He stood rooted to the spot amidst the fiery space, the rhythmic clang of the hammer echoing in his ears, stimulating all his senses. In Adrian's eyes, only the image of the old blacksmith, battling alone against a stubborn block of steel, remained. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Adrian was stunned, wondering what this strange tremor running down his spine truly was. The scene shifted outside. Lord Edgar Allan reported as he walked that the old man had been forging and melting swords for the past 6 months. Adrian wondered if they were all failures, but Edgar was equally clueless and dared not make any rash assertions. The old man was renowned as a master swordsmith. Every piece he crafted was considered a masterpiece in the eyes of ordinary people. Swords perfect in every detail were mercilessly melted down by his own hands, an incomprehensible waste. Edgar recounted anxiously that for the past month, the old man had barely slept, only burying himself in work like a madman. The Lord of Ellen feared that the old blacksmith's body would collapse before he could complete his final masterpiece. The tale of a true artisan echoed amidst the grand estate, yet filled with invisible pressure. Days passed, and Adrian practically camped at the forge from early morning until late night, observing the eccentric old man. The old blacksmith still swung his hammer wildly as if to shatter the anvil, sweat pouring like a river despite his age. Adrian stood with his arms crossed, observing, his sharp gaze missing none of the tenacious old man's movements. Edgar Allan stood outside, fretting, fearing the blacksmith would collapse before achieving anything due to the pressure of rumors. Night fell silently, with only the harsh clang of metal echoing through the space like a battle symphony. For several days straight, Adrian and the old blacksmith engaged in a test of endurance. One forged desperately, the other watched tirelessly. Adrian remained silent, his handsome face showing a hint of disappointment, having waited so long without seeing the hot item emerge from the forge. The blacksmith gritted his teeth, pouring all his remaining life force into the final, powerful hammer blows. Adrian sighed, his voice weary as he admitted he had hoped to witness the masterpiece before having to depart. Edgar looked at the young prince with a sympathetic gaze, unsure how to offer appropriate words of comfort. Adrian turned and walked away, his retreating figure exuding regret for the fruitless wait of so many days. Carl appeared in shining armor, urging everyone to leave in time for the farewell banquet that evening. Edgar watched Adrian's retreating back, silently understanding that the prince truly respected the talent of this eccentric blacksmith. Sunlight shone upon the estate, signaling the time for departure, yet the sword was still nowhere to be seen. Adrian placed his hand on the carriage door, preparing to leave in a less than cheerful mood, having missed his chance. Suddenly, Edgar's frantic shout tore through the air, making Adrian halt right at the carriage door. Edgar rushed over, shouting loudly with earth-shattering news. The master swordsmith had completed his work. Adrian spun around, his eyes wide with astonishment at this dramatic last-minute turn of events. Under the brilliant sunset, the blacksmith stood towering like a deity, his hand raising the newly forged sword. His rough hand gently wiped away the layer of dust, revealing a blade so chillingly sharp, it sent shivers down one's spine. The sword shimmered brilliantly under the sunlight, proving the caliber of a true masterpiece, worthy of the weight. The blade's surface, polished like a mirror, reflected Adrian's sharp gaze as he listened to the solemn oath of presenting the sword. Adrian held the sword in his hand, feeling the weight of power and perfection reserved for a monarch. Edgar Allan and Carl stood frozen in place, mouths agape and eyes wide with awe at the overwhelming aura emanating from the newly forged weapon. The prophecy of sword forging echoed, likening the process of heating metal to the brilliant sunrise over a mountain peak. Adrian drew the sword. Its blade was cooled so perfectly that its color rivaled the king's crimson dragon robe. He raised the sword high, a proud smile on his lips, as if affirming the birth of a glorious, sun-like king, just as the blacksmith's song foretold. Adrian admired the exquisitely crafted hilt, then asked if this formidable item already had a name. The blacksmith knelt, his body gaunt, respectfully proposing the name Twilight for his lifelong masterpiece. Adrian looked at the sword plunged into the ground, creating a magnificent scene, then subtly retorted, asking if it signified a fading twilight or a radiant dawn. He burst into hearty laughter, never expecting an old man who spent his days merely hammering could utter such eloquent and philosophical words. The blacksmith offered a relieved smile, sweat pouring off him like a shower after he had poured all his life force into the final strike. No sooner had he finished speaking than he collapsed like a felled tree. But Adrian quickly caught his frail body. The old man had completely passed out, sinking into unconsciousness after a display of skill that transcended all limits. Adrian supported the blacksmith, then turned to order his bewildered subordinates to immediately inform his uncle. He declared bluntly that he would stay and sleep here tonight to keep watch, no longer bothering to return to the estate. Night fell, and royal guards, holding torches, stood strict watch outside the tent, creating a silent atmosphere. Inside the tent, Adrian sat pensively on a chair, observing the deeply sleeping blacksmith, the new sword propped right beside the bed. He recalled the eloquent words about the sword choosing its own birth date by destiny, with the prince standing behind the craftsman. Adrian leaned closer to the old man's face, his eyes sharp and calculating as he asked if the old man truly believed in that hollow reason of destiny. He leaned in close and whispered an earth-shattering truth that made the blacksmith, even in his unconscious state, open his eyes in utter horror. Adrian confirmed his true identity, causing the dazed old blacksmith to awaken in astonishment. The old man let out a heavy sigh, his eyes shining with deep understanding for the master before him. The old blacksmith was content, having finally found someone worthy to entrust his life's heart and soul to. Adrian gently extended his hand, asking the old man to hand over the sword he had just completed with his very life. He took the sword hilt from the old blacksmith's trembling yet trusting hands. The old man's hand gripped the weapon one last time, as if wanting to pour his remaining life force into it. With his last bit of strength, the old blacksmith pleaded for the sword to become great, worthy of its new master. Adrian solemnly looked at the sword, etching the master's weighty, dying words into his heart. He was silent for a moment, his sharp eyes promising not to let this dedication go to waste. Adrian firmly asserted that this sword would surely bring glory to its creator. He sat quietly by the sickbed, guarding the old blacksmith's final sleep. The old man passed away peacefully, leaving a contented smile on his old, wrinkled face. The silent night enveloped the camp, closing a day full of emotions and turmoil. The next morning, Edgar Allan gleefully brought a flashy sword housed in a luxurious wooden box. The lord disparaged the old blacksmith's worn sword and offered to trade it for this shiny, mass-produced item. Adrian picked up the new magic sword to examine it, judging it to be a usable mid-grade item. Not bad. He praised the gift, but the smile on his lips began to reek of calculation, making Edgar uneasy. Adrian spectacularly turned the tables, deciding to seize both the magic sword and the dedicated sword. Edgar Allan stood frozen stiff, sweat pouring down him like rain, trapped in a situation where he lost everything. The cavalry immediately galloped, leading the army, rushing to make up for lost time. The soldiers unanimously shouted their obedience, their morale burning brightly as they prepared for the urgent march. Carl, holding the reins, approached Adrian and made a polite remark about the prince's busy schedule. He explained his disappearance these past few days was due to carrying out a secret order from the king. Adrian put a hand to his chin and thought, realizing the price for this outing was not cheap at all. Carl sternly demanded Adrian prepare his horse immediately to gallop to the castle on schedule. Adrian, with a blank face, confessed a shocking truth. He didn't know how to ride a horse, causing the atmosphere to deflate. Carl was speechless after hearing this, sweat pouring down him like rain, due to the unimaginable uselessness of this prince. Adrian defended himself in his mind, reasoning that in his previous life, he was a sword. So how could he possibly have had a chance to learn to ride a horse? As a result, Adrian vomited a rainbow due to motion sickness, forcing Adelia to pat his back and care for him attentively. He clung tightly to the rearing horse, screaming loudly while the blonde soldier behind him laughed uncontrollably. The entire journey was a chaotic tragicomedy, as Adrian was tormented by the horse, running wildly everywhere. Finally, Adrian managed to crawl forward with a pale face, his spirit scattered and devoid of any vitality. Although later than expected, the army finally reached the gates of the majestic Iron Lion Castle after a long day of torment. Adrian looked up at the sturdy fortress before him, secretly assessing its scale, while the blonde soldier marveled. The thudding footsteps of the host knights advanced to greet them, breaking the silent atmosphere. York Walladon loudly proclaimed a welcome full of formality and politeness for the royal bloodline of Leon Burke. Adrian smirked. He was more than capable of sensing the thick, killing intent hidden behind that fake greeting. The Iron Lion knights behind them scowled, their eyes full of hostility, as if wanting to devour the visitors alive. Arwen Kurgayan stepped out from the ranks with a cold expression, her aura overwhelming the men around her. Adrian called Arwen's name provocatively, ready to stir up this lion's den a little for some entertainment. Arwen Kurgayan bowed in salute with a cold expression, placed her hand on her chest, and uttered the two words, "Your Highness," with formality. She knelt on one knee, offering a welcome reeking of sarcasm about counting the days to meet him again. The knights behind erupted with killing intent like a flame, wanting to incinerate everything, making Adrian amused to notice this fierce reaction. Adelia Byrne immediately activated her master protection mode, her eyes glowing with golden killing intent, making Adrian break out in a cold sweat from surprise. He hastily placed a hand on the maid's shoulder to calm her, preventing the monster within her from breaking loose and slaughtering the opponents on the spot. The killing intent vanished, and Adelia blinked blankly at her master, as if just waking from a trance. She obediently bowed and complied, proving Adrian's brainwashing and training efforts had worked perfectly. Having resolved the internal trouble, Adrian turned back with a half-smile, full of confidence and arrogance. He ordered Arwen to follow him, ignoring the knights behind him, who were glaring daggers. Adrian added another provocative remark, inviting the entire trailing group to follow along to settle scores all at once for fun. At the training ground, Adrian had changed into a neat white shirt, carrying a wooden sword on his shoulder with an extremely relaxed demeanor. He stood before the ranks of the Iron Lion Knights, loudly challenging anyone skilled enough to spar with him and broaden his horizons. The knights exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to step forward as the first guinea pig, wary of his royal status. Seeing the absolute silence, Adrian looked disappointed and began using psychological tactics to provoke them. He invoked the honor of the Leon Burke family, guaranteeing no repercussions, effectively giving them free rein to vent their anger. Adrian delivered the decisive blow by insulting the kingdom's top-ranked title as mere empty prestige, infuriating the knights. A red-haired knight, unable to bear it, aggressively stepped out of the ranks, introducing himself as Dale of House Dinant. Adrian smirked with satisfaction as the fish took the bait, while the other man still tried to maintain a facade of courtesy before lunging to devour him. Dale swung his wooden sword high, shouting for permission to properly instruct the prince in a match to appease his anger. Adrian coolly declared that no one needed permission, as he was the one who initiated the confrontation. Dale Dennant charged like a moth to a flame with his wooden sword, shouting for the prince to be careful, yet swinging with all his might. Adrian merely tilted his body slightly to effortlessly dodge all attacks, a scornful smile on his face as he watched his opponent flail in vain. A lightning-fast counterattack, accompanied by a blue lightning bolt, struck Dale directly, leaving him no time to react. The red-haired knight's eyes widened, blood gushed from his mouth, and his face contorted from the excruciating blow to his chest. Dale's entire body plunged straight into the ground, forming a small crater, officially defeated after a single move. Adrian stood upright, his chest glowing with the blue light of his mana heart, and coldly uttered a single word. Next, sending shivers down everyone's spines in the training ground. The remaining Iron Lion Knights turned pale upon seeing their comrade knocked out, and the atmosphere visibly dampened. A knight named Paul Rothheim aggressively jumped out, boasting loudly that he was a third year, not a rookie first year like Dale. Before he could finish speaking, Adrian's wooden sword slapped him, distorting his face and sending both him and his dignity flying. Adrian began his classic herding chickens display, successively sending Hallie, Judith, and other minor figures to the scoreboard with a single blow each. He swung his sword as if swatting flies, his face showing boredom, because this group was too weak compared to his expectations, not even worth his warm-up. All the knights were sent flying into the air like torn sandbags, creating an unprecedented chaotic scene at the royal training ground. Adrian stood tall amidst the battlefield, strewn with fallen bodies, while those still standing trembled, not daring to breathe heavily. He sighed in exasperation, his face clearly showing disappointment that these talents couldn't even make him break a sweat. Adrian turned to the remaining, fearfully whispering remnants, demanding to fight official knights because these apprentices were too slow. He unexpectedly called Arwen's name, making her jump in fright, beads of sweat trickling down her face from anxiety. Adrian ordered Arwen to follow him after he returned, his domineering tone allowing no refusal. Arwen silently watched Adrian's retreating back, a subtle, meaningful smile gracing her lips instead of her usual annoyance. Arwen bowed her head, obeying as your grace wishes, while Adrian stood there with a bored expression, holding the wooden stick as if it were a toy. He sneered, thinking to himself, too easy, just as a silver-haired man stepped out with an overly confident smile, interrupting his thoughts. Amidst the battlefield littered with knocked-out individuals, the silver-haired man gestured, proposing a wager to liven up the dull atmosphere. Before he could finish his sentence, if I defeat your grace. Adrian immediately doused him with a cold, refused, and a sharp gaze. Adrian coolly declared that Arwen was not a prize, asserting his ownership and protecting his subordinate with such coolness that the other man was speechless. The embarrassed silver-haired man had no choice but to change the terms, ordering a soldier to bring out another sword as a substitute wager for the girl. Adrian smirked with interest as he saw his prey beginning to take the bait, his eyes gleaming with calculation. He raised the stakes, pulling out the recently forged masterpiece sword to wager, its radiating aura dazzling everyone. Arwen's eyes widened in astonishment, breaking into a sweat, as she never expected her master to wager such an invaluable treasure. The silver-haired man also froze for a few seconds, his mouth agape as he witnessed the extraordinary aura emanating from the sword in Adrian's hand. Arwen frantically tried to intervene, believing she should be the one responsible, not that precious sword. Adrian cut her off with a highly impactful, romantic line. You are 100,000 times more precious than this sword. He added a final blow that completely stunned Arwen. The value of a future sword saint cannot be compared to a piece of scrap metal. The silver-haired man smugly accepted the tempting wager, thinking he was about to snatch a valuable prize from the prince's hands. He introduced himself as Dunham of House Fahrenheit, proudly boasting that he was an official knight and on the verge of reaching the triple chain realm. Adrian immediately retorted with a sarcastic chibi face. In short, you're still just a double chain, aren't you? Dunham, annoyed, drew his sword, showing off that it was the 17th work of the legendary mastersmith of swords to regain his dignity. He set the condition that if he won, he would take Adrian's sword, unaware that Adrian was secretly smiling at this interesting coincidence. Dunham lunged down, launching a preemptive attack from above, but Adrian calmly drew his sword, revealing that his own blade also came from the same forge. Adrian delivered a powerful twist, declaring that the sword in his hand was none other than the legendary 100th masterpiece of the mastersmith of swords. Dunham broke out in a cold sweat, his face paling because he had never heard rumors of this final sword, yet he tried to maintain his composure. The silver-haired man tried to salvage his dignity by switching to a serious mode, lecturing Adrian about his misguided path, even though he was trembling inside. He erupted blue mana around himself, declaring with an air of superiority that he would use his full power to respect the efforts of the discarded prince. Adrian placed a hand on his chest and sneered, considering his opponent's judgments as worthless trash. Dunham swung his sword and charged to attack, while Adrian began an epic internal monologue about his true standing. Adelia froze upon hearing her master speak of respect. Her eyes wavered intensely before Adrian's imposing aura. Arwen observed from behind with a solemn expression, witnessing the overwhelming aura Adrian began to emit. Adrian's eyes glowed with blue mana. He declared with supreme dominance that only respect from those who belonged to him was enough. He turned and ordered Adelia to open her eyes wide and carefully observe the peak technique about to be unleashed. Adrian unleashed terrifying power, creating a mana storm that formed a gigantic night avatar engulfing him. The radiant blue night phantom appeared like a deity. Adrian affirmed that this was the path Adilia must walk. Adelia trembled as she received the instruction, her mind completely subdued by this display of absolute power. Resonance occurred. Adelia erupted with a brilliant golden aura like flames surrounding her, while Adrian swung his sword, sweeping everything away. She clenched her hand over her chest, her eyes burning with determination, vowing to follow the tyrannical path her master had laid out. The scene shifted to a quiet tea table, but the atmosphere reeked of political machinations. York Walloden was conversing with a distinguished guest, discussing how this was the 4th time a royal had visited the castle. Vale Balorhard pondered deeply, a long scar over his eye, exuding the dangerous aura of an old fox from the north. The conversation revealed that other princes had all come here to vie for power. Even the ambitious second prince had just paid a visit. York placed his teacup on the table, his voice firm as he asserted that even if his reputation was in tatters, the first prince was still the legitimate heir. The old man Walloden pointed directly at Vale with a harsh attitude, holding him responsible for letting things go this far. If the commander of the 3rd Legion had supported the first prince even slightly, he would not have been isolated among wolves like this. Vale sat silently, enduring the accusation, his eyes heavy as he admitted he had once cruelly cast his own nephew aside. In his memory, the Adrian of old was merely a tyrant, who was all bark and no bite, constantly steeped in alcohol and ignorance. Vale recalled the devastating slap he gave his drunken nephew, yelling directly at him, asking if he had any shame left. The obese prince gnashed his teeth, his face flushed red from humiliation, yet showing no remorse. The pinnacle of his uselessness was when he dared to draw his sword and attack his own blood uncle. Reflected in Vale's eyes at that time was only the image of an incorrigible scoundrel, not worth bothering with. When Vale returned to the north in disappointment, his dear nephew even sent him a bottle of poisoned wine along with a shameless letter. Vale's black-gloved hand crushed the neck of the wine bottle, his long-suppressed rage on the verge of erupting. He tilted his head back and drank the poisoned wine dry, activating his blue lightning mana to burn away all impurities within his body. Vale's eyes blazed with electricity. He used that very mana flame to incinerate the last vestiges of familial affection. Yet, the scoundrel of old had now completely transformed. He was training frantically and growing stronger every day like a monster. Vale returned to reality, questioning York about his previous declaration forbidding the first prince from ascending the throne. Seeing the reflection of his nephew diligently swinging his sword in the teacup, Vale clenched his fist, full of faith in this rebirth. The northern commander lowered his voice, pleading with York to give Adrian a chance to stand on equal footing with the other princes. A shocking sight as Vale bowed deeply before York, casting aside his pride to beg for his nephew. York broke out in a cold sweat, his face dumbfounded, unable to comprehend why the old fox of the north had changed so drastically. Vale mused, admitting he himself wasn't sure if it was because of himself, or if the first prince had changed beyond recognition. The door burst open with a bang, startling York as a frantic soldier rushed in with urgent news. The soldier stammered, announcing shocking news about the first prince, causing York to break out in a cold sweat while Vale's face hardened as he listened. The two hurried towards the academy's training ground, from where terrifying sounds of battle were emanating. York still tried to reassure himself that even if Adrian was mad, he wouldn't dare to severely injure a royal family member without reason. Vale sneered, bluntly warning that the one to worry about now was not the prince, but York's knight. York looked at Vale as if he were an alien, thinking the old man was spouting nonsense due to the current stressful situation. With a thud, Dunham Fahrenheit's figure was sent flying out the door, soaring directly towards the two approaching officials. The elite knight, eyes rolled back and foaming at the mouth, floated in midair amidst York's utter shock. Adrian stood tall in the training ground, his blue aura blazing, surrounded by thunderous cheers celebrating his overwhelming victory. York stood frozen, asking what the hell was happening, while Vale, arms crossed, smugly repeated his earlier warning. Adrian wiped a trace of blood from his mouth, his sharp eyes showing no sign of wanting to stop after the battle. He laughed like a bloodthirsty madman, shouting for the next prey to step forward and face him immediately. In the preceding moments of combat, Dunham had unleashed the true power of a two-chain knight, just as rumored. Adrian gasped for breath, constantly moving to evade the deadly sword strikes enveloped in his opponent's blue mana. Dunham slashed with immense force, tearing through the air, but Adrian spectacularly dodged the attack, slipping past right by the blade's edge. Adrian gritted his teeth, holding back, telling himself he couldn't unleash his ultimate dragon-slaying technique against an ordinary knight like this one. The hyper-focus trait activated, and Adrian charged straight at his opponent with terrifying calmness, ignoring all surrounding noise. All sounds seemed to fade away as Adrian poured all his mana into his sword, preparing to deliver the decisive blow. Dunham roared like a cornered beast, swinging his sword down in desperation to salvage his honor. Adrian tightened his grip on the hilt, feeling his body surpassing its physical limits, every muscle fiber screaming. His mana eye blazed with blue light, awakening the familiar sensation of those hellish days of old. And everything around him suddenly slowed down. Dunham unleashed a slash that tore through space, but Adrian glided away as light as a feather, leaving behind a blue afterimage that caused his opponent to strike empty air. With a single counterattack, Adrian sent Dunham flying backward like a tattered sandbag, to the utter astonishment of the watching knights. He wiped blood from the corner of his mouth, curling his lips into an arrogant, provocative smile, as if he had only just finished warming up. Adrian stood in the sun-drenched arena, shouting a challenge, demanding the next prey to step forward and surrender immediately. A blonde knight named Piton charged in to fight. Their clashing sword energies created dazzling sparks, but Adrian stood firm as a rock. Adrian looked at his opponent with a contemptuous gaze. Blue mana surged around his neck like a coiling dragon, completely overwhelming his opponent's aura. He moved with dazzling speed, causing Piton's attacks to futilely strike empty air. The two swords clashed loudly. Adrian's overwhelming power made the knight tremble, sweat pouring down like rain. Adrian spun around, unleashing his blade, which drew a blue arc of death sweeping across the battlefield. He fought fiercely, successively defeating the red-haired one, then the blonde one, turning the training ground into his personal stage. His blue eyes blazed with killing intent. Adrian was completely immersed in a hyper-focused combat state, showing no mercy. The defeated one's sword fell to the ground, embedding itself into the cold stone floor, signaling a crushing defeat. Adrian stood tall amidst a brilliant aura, surrounded by his defeated opponents lying scattered on the ground, none having the strength to stand up. He panted, drenched in sweat, but his eyes still burned with fighting spirit, savoring the feeling of victory coursing through his veins. The Iron Lion Knights cheered excitedly at Piton's defeat, confirming the prince's fifth consecutive and convincing victory. The system announced the War Spirit Hymn skill had leveled up. A majestic, blazing blue spirit figure appeared, marking Adrian's complete transformation. The system blasted a fierce notification. The War Spirit Hymn skill had officially broken through to the extraordinary level. The new name, Duel Melody, appeared. Adrian stood tall amidst an overbearing surge of blue energy. Adrian let out a long breath, drenched in sweat, but a satisfied smile of one who had just mastered the game curled on his lips. He stumbled, his legs weak after the overwhelming display, which almost made him fall flat on his face. A steady arm from the blue-cloaked commander timely supported the exhausted prince. The knight looked at him with an admiring gaze, declaring his respect for Adrian's convincing victory. All the Iron Lions unanimously raised their hands and cheered, shouting slogans honoring the fighting spirit and blade of the Grand Prince. Adrian was dumbfounded, his face blank, not understanding why the people who had just been ready to tear him apart had changed their tune so quickly. York Walloden watched from afar, curling his lips as he explained to Adrian that the nature of these martial brutes was very simple. He asserted that nothing excited these knights more than a spectacular sword fight and an overwhelming victory. The noble saw through Adrian's heart, correctly guessing that the prince was worried about the soldiers holding grudges and seeking revenge. York Walloden explained the principle that a fair defeat was more valuable than a dirty victory when both sides had fought their hardest. Dale Dennant laughed gleefully with his comrades, teasing that the silver-haired Dunham must be seething with rage for having to offer his precious sword to the prince. Adrian chuckled with amusement upon hearing that, realizing that the old values he thought were lost still existed. He looked towards the sunset, his gaze softened, as he saw that at least one thing remained unchanged by time. Respect for the strong and acceptance of defeat was the immortal core of what was called the knightly spirit. At the end of the training session, Adrian prepared to board his carriage to return. Amidst the solemn farewell of the crowd of knights and servants, he turned back to bid farewell with a refined yet confident demeanor, promising to meet again on the arena floor. York Walladon bowed respectfully in farewell, receiving an implied reminder from Adrian to take care of his health before the carriage set off. Adrian called York Walladon back to give some important instructions before they went their separate ways. He requested that what happened here be kept secret, which dumbfounded York Walladon, as he thought making it public would make the prince's reputation soar. Adrian sneered calculatingly, his hand on his chin, his eyes gleaming with the cunning of someone hatching a grand scheme. His target was none other than the second prince, the one he was eager to tease and teach a lesson to, just to get even. The Iron Lion Knights began setting up camp and unloading supplies to rest as dusk fell over the forest. The blonde guard asked permission to patrol the surroundings for a while, and Adrian immediately nodded in agreement. Arwen Kurgayan stood frozen stiff, her face cold, but her eyes unsure how to address her new master. Seeing Adrian glance at her, the girl broke out in a cold sweat from tension, but he believed she would get used to it sooner or later. Adrian yawned widely, about to enter his tent for a nap, when he suddenly stopped short at the strange sight inside. Adelia Bayern appeared as a dazzling maid, welcoming him back like a devoted wife awaiting her husband. He was utterly speechless to see an S-rank sword genius doing trivial maid chores instead of honing her talent. Seeing Adrian listlessly ignore her, Adelia Bayern became anxious, hastily asking if she had done anything wrong to displease him. He collapsed onto the bed and waved his hand to subtly dismiss her, making her dejectedly leave with a face as sad as if she had lost her ration book. Lying with his arm across his forehead, Adrian pondered the true strength of the Iron Lion Knights, which was far different from what he had predicted. When he activated his judgment ability, he realized that most of these knights only had mediocre sword talent, ranking B or C. In the old era, these people, even if they toiled their entire lives, would be mere nobodies, never reaching the expert threshold. Yet now, these small fry had achieved the level of a swordmaster at a very young age, only in their 20s or 30s. While the quality of superhumans plummeted uncontrollably, the skill level of ordinary people surged astonishingly. Adrian sprang up from the bed with sharp eyes, firmly asserting that the main reason was something called mana chains. My uncle is a true monster, one who could have reached the transcendent threshold if not for the times. But this era is so crippled that auras are limited, and no one can cultivate past the extraordinary level. Adrian clenched his fist, concluding that all this degradation was due to the erosion of time. He sat on the bed, admitting he was clueless about the current meta, and decided to relearn everything from scratch. A round of applause echoed, interrupting his thoughts and praising his positive mindset. Vale Ballarhard stood there applauding, encouraging his nephew that it was not too late to strive for his dreams. He wondered if Adrian hadn't already won the trust of the Iron Lion Knights, which left Adrian dumbfounded. The old fox smiled meaningfully, praising his beloved nephew's wise decision. Adrian got goosebumps all over, wondering what kind of strange medicine the old man had taken today to act so oddly. He broke out in a cold sweat, asking if his uncle had gone mad, and reminding him of the terms of their bet. Adrian hastily clarified that if it was the bet to defeat the third prince, it wasn't time to settle scores yet. He asserted that the bet was to defeat a double-chain knight, and with his recent outplay of Dunham, he considered himself to have won. Heavy footsteps echoed on the floor as Vale Ballarhard stepped forward to fulfill his old promise. Adrian wore a blank expression full of question marks, not understanding what trick his uncle was planning next. Vale Ballarhard grandly announced his name, listing all his titles as Count and Legion Commander to assert his authority. He placed his hand on his chest and swore to officially support the first Prince Adrian Leon Burke, which left Adrian utterly bewildered. Adrian's face turned pale, and he stammered in horror as he realized the worst-case scenario was unfolding. While his uncle gave a confident thumbs up, Adrian desperately screamed that he never wanted to be king. His uncle's declaration was like an atomic bomb exploding in the palace, causing everyone to flock around and congratulate the first prince. The surrounding crowd applauded enthusiastically, as if Adrian Leon Burke had already ascended to the throne. Newly deployed royal guards and knights arrived in a clamor, causing a commotion throughout the area. Servants and attendants from the palace also rushed over to curry favor with their new master. Adrian Leon Burke stood frozen in the eye of the storm, his mind reeling from suddenly becoming the center of the universe. He couldn't take it anymore and immediately pointed to the door, loudly yelling and demanding everyone be thrown out immediately. The blonde guard grimaced and explained this was a royal decree, leaving Adrian Leon Burke speechless, silently begging them to disappear from his sight. The guard wearily obeyed, feeling that serving this prince was truly a deadly nuisance. The curtains were drawn, and Adrian Leon Burke leaned back in his chair, sighing in relief, that he finally had some peace. Bang! The room door burst open violently, interrupting his short-lived moment of rest. Gillian Leon Burke entered with overwhelming killing intent, demanding to know why Adrian Leon Burke was here at this moment. The third prince, Gillian Leon Burke, sneered, sarcastically praising Adrian Leon Burke for playing the fool too perfectly. He bitterly accused Adrian Leon Burke of secretly learning swordsmanship from Count Balerhard to harbor grand ambitions. Adrian Leon Burke wore a blank expression, not understanding anything. While Gillian Leon Burke continued to ramble on about intending to indulge him, Gillian Leon Burke pointed directly at Adrian Leon Burke, declaring he would make his elder brother pay dearly for daring to deceive him. Adrian Leon Burke clutched his head in helplessness, going mad from repeatedly explaining that he had no interest in the throne. He decided he had to immediately find the instigator who had caused this ironic situation to settle the score. Adrian Leon Burke went to the camp to confront his uncle Vale Balorhard and have a serious talk. He crossed his arms and laid down a condition that he would only play along for a while, and then gracefully withdraw, as he had no desire for power. Vale Balorhard smiled meaningfully, reminding his nephew about the Balorhard wall that was guarding against the monsters of the north. Vale Balorhard smirked meaningfully, subtly hinting that as long as the royal family didn't forget the harshness of winter, his family would be fine. The uncle looked down at Adrian Leon Burke with a sharp gaze, asserting that the struggle for power was inevitable. Vale Balorhard stood up, exerting pressure, and directly asked his nephew if he knew the tragic fate of a firstborn who failed to inherit the throne. Before leaving, the uncle turned back and delivered a chilling final remark, reminding Adrian Leon Burke that the truth would not change, no matter how much he tried to evade it. Adrian Leon Burke sat blankly on his bed, grappling with the truth that the authority of the firstborn would cling to him until his death. Slam! The door closed, leaving Adrian Leon Burke sighing in exasperation, affirming that no amount of time would make him change his mind. In his mind, he summoned the holy sword, roaring that what he truly needed was power, reaching absolute transcendence. Adrian Leon Burke sneered arrogantly, disdaining the right to inherit the throne as mere trivial garbage not worth his concern. The brilliant chandelier light illuminated the grand hall, signaling a magnificent royal spectacle was about to begin. Contrary to his expectations, footsteps echoed steadily as the announcer grandly introduced the arrival of the legitimate bloodline of the Leon Burke kingdom. Adrian Leon Burke entered the grand hall with a commanding presence, making the entire noble crowd below hold their breath and look up. Vale Balerhard stood with his arms crossed, satisfied, while Taylor Tailheim and the nobles gawked, wide-eyed, at the overwhelming aura of the first prince. A mysterious woman wearing a purple hood lurked in the shadows, revealing a calculating smile upon seeing her prey appear. Adrian Leon Burke stood on the balcony in a striking red and black ceremonial attire, officially opening the tumultuous banquet. His hand rested lightly on the stair railing. Every gesture exuded royalty, making the surrounding atmosphere as tense as a drawn bowstring. He descended each step with an icy expression, ignoring all scrutinizing gazes that pierced him like daggers. The noble young ladies blushed, praising him for looking exactly like the young king. But Adrian Leon Burke only found it bothersome, because after losing weight, he was receiving excessive attention. He glanced around with extreme contempt, wondering if this lavishly dressed crowd deserved to be called nobles. Activating judgment, Adrian Leon Burke scoffed as he saw through the rotten nature of the entire hall, everyone bearing the deceptive serpent's heart trait. Adrian stood in the middle of the hall. Using his divine eyes, he saw the surrounding nobles were all hypocrites, entwined by karmic snakes. He immediately spotted Taylor Tailheim cowering in a corner, his face drained of color as he saw the menacing figure approach. Adrian raised his hand in a polite greeting, but his smile was full of pressure, making Taylor break out in a cold sweat from fear. The young Taylor trembled as memories of being relentlessly beaten by the obese Adrian with a wooden sword flooded his mind, haunting him. Adrian assessed Taylor as having mediocre abilities, but at least he was untainted, temporarily accepting him as a pawn for his upcoming plans. A sharp cry for attention rang out from a guard, interrupting his calculating thoughts. The grand doors swung open, welcoming Marquis Montpellier, the ambassador of the Bourgogne Empire, who entered with solemnity. Adrian whirled around, his face changing color, and his eyes sharpening upon hearing the name of the enemy nation. The entire hall bowed respectfully before the corpulent ambassador, who strutted in like a prize pig. Ambassador Couillon walked with his nose in the air, a look of smugness and arrogance clearly visible on every jiggling inch of his flesh. The fat man stood towering before Adrian, opening his mouth to offer a polite greeting with a condescending attitude that disregarded everyone. Adrian's eyes glowed with a deadly blue light. He had to clench his teeth to suppress the rage exploding within his chest. Images of the Bourgogne Legion, the sworn enemy that had caused countless blood debts 400 years ago, came vividly to his mind. Adrian's killing intent surged. He hadn't expected his mortal enemy to dare show their face here and stand right before him. Splash! A gray-haired noble suddenly rushed forward, splashing a full glass of red wine onto Adrian just as he was distracted. Adrian looked down at the crimson wine stain spreading on his expensive ceremonial attire, his face icy, yet radiating extreme danger. The man cried out in panic, then hastily explained that he had merely slipped due to rushing to greet him. He bowed repeatedly in apology, sweating profusely, while Adrian stood still, enduring the situation in his soaking wet and sticky clothes. Adrian glared at the clumsy noble, his sharp gaze seeming to want to flay the audacious person who had just soiled his clothes. The corpulent Couillon Montpellier appeared with a smug expression, making one instantly want to punch him. The atmosphere grew tense. Adrian Leon Burke stood staring intently at the gray-haired noble who had just caused trouble, while the crowd held their breath waiting for the show. Adrian Leon Burke, suppressing his anger, coldly declared that he had to go change, while the old man bowed in apology as if performing a ritual. The blonde guard quickly offered a handkerchief for Adrian Leon Burke to wipe the stain. He wondered who that clumsy old man was. It turned out to be Marquis Bielefeld. Seeing him clutching his chest and bowing, it was clear his remorse was genuine, not an act. Adrian Leon Burke wiped the wine stain while sneering. Thanks to this cold splash, his head, burning with killing intent, finally cooled down. As night fell, Adrian Leon Burke stood alone on the balcony, letting the cold wind blow away his tangled thoughts. Carl entered the room. Seeing his master sitting blankly in the darkness, he immediately inquired about the earlier incident. Carl's face showed a stern expression. He conveyed Marquis Bielefeld's observations regarding Adrian's demeanor. Carl relayed that the Marquis perceived Adrian Leon Burke at that moment as a ticking time bomb about to cause great disaster for the entire banquet. Adrian Leon Burke's eyes glowed with a murderous blue light. He admitted that the old man was not wrong at all about his mood. Carl questioned what on earth he intended to do, but Adrian Leon Burke calmly replied that he wasn't being reckless, but simply couldn't swallow this insult. In Adrian Leon Burke's eyes, the wicked Bourgogne family was flaunting its power right in the capital, while the nobles fawned over and revered the corpulent Couillon Montpellier more than their own king. A tense atmosphere enveloped them. This was not peace, but the humiliating submission of a one-sided relationship. Adrian Leon Burke gnashed his teeth in anger, unable to comprehend why his country had fallen into such a pathetic and cowardly state. Carl sighed with a resigned expression, beginning to recount a historical tale that was unremarkable yet full of bitterness. The glorious past resurfaced. The kingdom had once valiantly resisted countless invasions from the empire with its bravest knights, but as time passed, the empire increasingly expanded its power, becoming a colossal monster that devoured everything in its path. Faced with the overwhelming might of the superpower, the kingdom's shield shattered, leaving them no choice but to kneel in surrender. Adrian Leon Burke broke out in a cold sweat, realizing that the root cause of everything was precisely that. A map of the continent appeared, revealing the ridiculous disparity in power between the tiny Leon Burke kingdom and the colossal Bourgogne Empire. Fragments of memories pieced together a heroic historical tapestry, from nobodies rising to become dragon-slaying legends. The image of the first king shone brilliantly with his holy sword, and the ultimate foundational technique, the hymn of the king. Adrian Leon Burke gazed at the blue mana flame blazing in his hand, bitterly admitting that his country had lost all that heritage. He turned to call his royal uncle, and coldly declared that he had completely changed his mind. The royal uncle was dumbfounded, not understanding what trick this troublesome nephew intended to pull next. Adrian Leon Burke placed a hand on his chest, his gaze resolute, as he declared he would try sitting on the king's throne. The royal uncle was stunned, a slight twitch in the scar on his face betraying his reaction to his nephew's insane yet charismatic ambition. Adrian Leon Burke smirked with a calculating smile, accepting the arduous path ahead because it was what had to be done. The magnificent scene of the palace on the second day of the banquet, where Adrian Leon Burke had once contributed to building half the realm. He adjusted his red and black royal ceremonial attire, preparing to step into the lion's den with the demeanor of a true hunter. A resounding announcement introduced Grand Prince Adrian Leon Burke and Count Vale, who entered the banquet hall with imposing authority. A sharp gaze from the crowd darted over, sensing the scent of danger from the powerful duo who had just appeared. The minor nobles bowed subserviently, breaking into a cold sweat and parting to either side before the oppressive aura emanating from them. Adrian Leon Burke and the royal uncle stood high above, looking down at the chaotic crowd, sneering mockingly at this utterly pathetic greeting ritual. Adrian Leon Burke's divine profile exuded a cold indifference, regarding the people below as nothing more than trash to be cleared away. Memories of the first king resurfaced. His starting point was merely a country bumpkin wielding a wooden sword, whom no one respected. Young Leon Burke stood alone amidst the ignorant villagers who pointed and mocked him. No one expected this rustic young man to make history. A steady footfall pressed onto the grass, marking the beginning of a great journey in the past. Young Leon Burke, holding a dull sword, stepped out to stand before the crowd, bravely facing the storm when no one else dared. The silhouette of the first king perfectly overlaid the current Adrian Leon Burke, affirming his status as a worthy successor. Adrian's eyes snapped open, his sharp gaze scrutinizing the blind fools packed into the banquet hall. A storm of blue mana erupted, sweeping through the noble crowd who stood bewildered like ducks hearing thunder. He began to activate the hymn of the king, proudly declaring that he stood towering above all these weak lambs. Even though the system warned his current skill level was insufficient, Adrian still overclocked, unleashing a quarter of the hymn to intimidate his opponents. He clutched his chest, enduring the backlash. But compared to the legendary dragon-slaying hymn, this minor hero-tier pain was merely a mosquito bite on stainless steel. His eyes blazed with determination. Adrian realized this power was more than enough to handle the current situation. A crown woven from blue mana slowly materialized above his head, asserting his unrivaled imperial status. A blue mana cloak swept through the banquet hall at dizzying speed, creating a visually overwhelming spectacle. The nobles' faces drained of color, their mouths agape in terror at the Grand Prince's true power. Adrian stood with his back turned, full of arrogance, adorned in a radiant cloak and crown that compelled thousands to bow. He smirked triumphantly, about to open his mouth and bestow favors upon the trembling crowd at his feet. Suddenly, a surge of dark purple killing intent tore through the air, interrupting his words with a piercing shriek. Adrian flinched and turned, sensing a chillingly familiar energy emanating from the mysterious hooded figure. The stranger pulled down their hood, revealing pointed ears that made Adrian exclaim in surprise at their elven identity. He broke out in a cold sweat, realizing this individual was not just an ordinary elf, but also someone who knew about the hymn of the king. Adrian was utterly panicked, his mind screaming as he beheld the stunning beauty of the madwoman who had just appeared, resplendent in a purple dress.